The sun blazed mercilessly overhead, casting harsh shadows across the sprawling parking lot where Ashley Johnson stood, her heart pounding with a mix of exhaustion and desperation. She leaned deeper into the front seat of her sleek black SUV, her fingers trembling as they sifted through a chaotic mess of old receipts, crumpled flyers, and scattered legal documents. The day had already stretched her thin hours spent in tense negotiations and endless paperwork at the courthouse, and now her wallet, that small but vital tether to her life, had vanished. Her phone buzzed incessantly on the passenger seat, each unanswered call from her office slicing deeper into her fraying nerves. She needed to get to a critical meeting with her colleagues, and time was slipping away like sand through her fingers. "Come on, where are you hiding?" she muttered under her breath, her voice tight with frustration as she shoved aside a stack of papers. Her mind raced, conjuring images of everything tucked inside that missing Walther ID. Her credit cards, the keys to her home. The thought of losing it all sent a shiver of panic down her spine. A faint sound, a low rumble, snapped her out of her spiraling thoughts. She straightened up abruptly, her dark eyes darting toward the source. A police cruiser rolled slowly past, its tires crunching against the asphalt, and inside sat an officer whose gaze locked onto her with a cold, calculating intensity. Ashley's stomach twisted. She hadn't done anything to draw attention, or so she thought. "I just need to find my wallet and get out of here," she told herself, forcing her breathing to steady as she turned back to her search. She willed the officer to keep driving, to let her be a fleeting figure in his rearview mirror. But the cruiser didn't move on. Instead, it slowed to a deliberate crawl before halting entirely a few yards away. The door creaked open, and out stepped Officer Stephen, a man whose stern features seemed carved from stone, his middle-aged frame radiating authority and judgment. His eyes raked over her, up, down, lingering suspicion etched into every line of his face. There was no warmth there, no trace of curiosity that might soften his scrutiny, only a hardness that made Ashley's chest tighten. She straightened her shoulders, trying to anchor herself despite the sudden racing of her pulse. She knew that look all too well, unspoken accusation, the assumption that clung to her like a shadow simply because of the color of her skin. Ashley wasn't new to this. As a black woman who had clawed her way through law school and into the role of a state attorney, she had faced prejudice in countless formless comments from professors who doubted her intellect, dismissive glances from colleagues who couldn't fathom her success, opportunities that slipped through her fingers because of biases too subtle to name, but too heavy to ignore. Each time, she had pushed back, her resilience forged in the fire of those battles. She had built a career on the pursuit of justice, a passion that burned brighter with every barrier she shattered. But standing here now, under Stephen's unyielding stare, all that strength felt fragile, teetering on the edge of a familiar abyss. "This is just a misunderstanding," she reassured herself, taking a slow, deliberate breath. "If I stay calm, explain myself, he'll see." Stephen planted himself in front of her, one hand resting casually on his belt near his holster. She couldn't help but notice the other gesturing sharply toward her SUV. "What are you doing here?" His voice was rough, gravelly, laced with a skepticism that seemed to dismiss her before she could even respond. Ashley met his gaze, her chin lifting slightly as she fought to keep her tone even. "I'm looking for my wallet," she said, her words soft but steady, carrying the quiet authority she'd honed in courtrooms. She hoped her politeness would pierce through his suspicion, that he'd see her as a person, not a threat. But Stephen's expression didn't soften. He stood there, immovable, his eyes narrowing as if searching for a crack in her story, a lie he was already convinced she was spinning. Irritation flickered to life inside her, a slow burn beneath her calm exterior. She hadn't done anything wrong. Did she feel like she was on trial? The sun beat down relentlessly, turning the air thick and oppressive, and Ashley sensed this encounter wouldn't unravel as easily as she'd hoped. "Do you have any identification?" Stephen pressed, his tone sharp, his gaze unrelenting. There was an edge to his words, a readiness to pounce on any misstep. Ashley blinked, a flicker of surprise mingling with the unease pooling in her gut. "I left my wallet in the car," she explained, her voice still measured despite the tremor she felt rising. "I'm just trying to find it. This is my car." She gestured toward the SUV. its polished surface gleaming under the sunlight, a testament to years of hard work. Stephen's eyebrow arched, his lips curling into a faint sneer. You expect me to believe a black woman like you owns this SUV, and without any identification? The words landed like a slap, raw and deliberate, stripping away her dignity in a single breath. Ashley's pride recoiled, a sharp pang slicing through her. It wasn't just doubt in his voice, it was contempt, a dismissal of her very existence as someone capable, someone worthy. A black woman like you. The phrase echoed in her mind, each syllable dripping with the weight of every stereotype she'd spent her life dismantling. She was a state attorney, a guardian of justice, yet here she stood, reduced to a suspect because of her skin. Her hands clenched briefly at her sides, a storm of emotions churning within shock at his audacity. Disappointment that this still happened, and a creeping helplessness that threatened to swallow her whole. Stephen didn't relent. Step out of the car and stand back, he ordered, his voice cutting through the stifling air. His hand hovered near his belt again, a silent assertion of power. Ashley hesitated, her mind racing. She knew the law knew her rights, but she also knew the reality of moments like this. Resistance could escalate everything, twist a simple misunderstanding into something far uglier. Stay calm, she told herself, even as bitterness surged beneath her skin. She had fought too hard, overcome too much, to be diminished like this in an instant. Slowly, she stepped back, raising her hands slightly to signal compliance, though every fiber of her being screamed against it. The injustice of it gnawed at her. Here she was, a woman who had dedicated her life to upholding the law, forced to bow to the whims of a man who saw her as less than human. He moved closer, his boots thudding against the pavement, his eyes never leaving her. Up and down his gaze traveled, sizing her up like she was a thief caught red-handed. You expect me to take your word without proof, he said, his voice thick with mockery. You'll need a better excuse than that if you want to get out of this. Ashley's heart hammered in her chest, each beat a drumroll of anxiety and outrage. She wanted to fire back, to tell him she didn't need an excuse, because she hadn't done anything wrong. But she bit her tongue, knowing how easily he could twist her words. How predetermined this judgment already seemed. Inside, she wrestled with a torrent of feelings, powerlessness at being stripped of her voice, fury at the unfairness of it all, and a quiet, simmering resolve that refused to break. She was a lawyer, damn it. She knew the law better than he ever would. Yet here, in this sun-scorched parking lot, that knowledge felt like a useless shield against his prejudice. Stephen's arrogance hung in the air, palpable in the way he squared his shoulders, the way his lips twitched with disdain. He had already convicted her in his no evidence needed, no questions asked. Ashley's silence stretched on, her emotions a tangled knot she fought to suppress. She knew speaking now might only fuel his fire, might give him the ammunition he craved to escalate this further. After a long, judgmental stare, he turned abruptly and began rummaging through her SUV, his hands pawing through her belongings without a shred of permission. Ashley stood frozen, humiliation washing over her as she watched him violate her space. How many others had stood in her shoes? She wondered, helpless, judged, their voices silenced by the same unyielding bias. She drew a shaky breath, forcing her voice to steady despite the anger blazing within. I am a state attorney, she said, her eyes locking onto his with fierce determination. I'm not who you think I am. This is my car, and I'm just trying to find my missing wallet. If you want to verify that, check the license plate or my information. Stephen paused, turning to face her, and for a moment, she thought she saw a flicker of doubt in his eyes. But then a smirk spread across his face, slow and mocking. A state attorney, he scoffed, shaking his head as if she'd told him a ridiculous fairy tale. You expect me to believe that? Someone like you, a state attorney, driving a car like this? That doesn't add up. His words were a dagger, each one laced with the same venom she'd heard too many times before. Someone like you. The implication was clear. A black woman couldn't possibly belong in a position of power, couldn't possibly own something valuable. It was an insult that cut deeper than he could ever know. A wound reopened with every syllable. Anger flared hot and bright within her, a righteous fury she struggled to contain. She wanted to scream, to demand he see her for who she was, not the caricature he'd painted in his mind. But she held back, knowing the stakes. At that moment, the parking lot wasn't empty anymore. A middle-aged man lingered in the distance, his brow furrowed in confusion as he pulled out his phone and began recording, the lens capturing every 10th second. Nearby, a young couple exchanged uneasy glances, their footsteps slowing as they took in the center, standing with her hands raised slightly. And Stephen, towering over her with an air of unchecked authority. Their presence shifted the air, a silent audience to this unfolding drama. Stephen's smirk faded as he noticed the onlookers, his posture stiffening. He stepped back, his hands still resting on his belt, but now his eyes darted toward the license plate of her SUV. Ashley watched him, her breath shallow, her mind racing with the lessons this moment laid bare. Justice wasn't blind, not here, not now. It was a fragile thing, easily warped by those who wielded power without accountability. Stephen's abuse of authority wasn't just a personal slight, it was a stark reminder of the consequences that rippled outward when prejudice went unchecked. For Ashley, it was a call to keep fighting, to hold the line against those who twisted the law into a weapon. And as the truth of her identity began to dawn on him, verified, perhaps, by a quick radio call or a glance at her registration, she saw the flicker of shock in his eyes, a crack in his smug facade. The lesson was hers to teach. Power without justice was a hollow shell, and its reckoning would always come. On a sunlit afternoon, the air thick with tension, a bustling crowd gathered on a dusty street corner, their murmurs blending into a low hum of curiosity and unease. Among them stood a middle-aged woman, her tailored coat and polished shoes marking her as someone of poise and purpose. Her brow furrowed as she watched the scene unfold, a flicker of indignation sparking in her chest. She couldn't stand idly by it when something so clearly unjust was playing out before her eyes. With a steadying breath, she stepped forward, her heels clicking sharply against the pavement. "Excuse me," she called out, her voice cutting through the murmurs like a blade, firm yet laced with a quiet concern. "Can someone please explain what's happening here?" She wasn't asking out of mere curiosity. There was a resolve in her tone, a need to peel back the layers of this troubling encounter. Stephen, a uniformed officer with a rigid posture and a scowl etched deep into his face, snapped his head toward her, his eyes narrowed, irritation flashing like a warning signal. He didn't appreciate this interruption from her, not from anyone. "This is a police matter." He shot back, his words clipped and icy, as though he could freeze her interference in its tracks. "I'm investigating suspicious behavior, and frankly, this doesn't concern you." His dismissal hung in the air, heavy and deliberate, but the woman didn't flinch. She held his gaze, unflinching, then shifted her attention to Ashley, the young woman at the center of this storm. Ashley stood there, her shoulders tense, her dark eyes flickering with a mix of frustration and quiet resilience. The woman saw a strain pulling at Ashley's features, the way her hands clenched briefly before relaxing. This wasn't just about a car or a confrontation, it was something deeper. Something that demanded fairness. Undeterred by Stephen's cold rebuff, the woman straightened her spine, her voice steady as she spoke again. "From where I'm standing, this woman deserves a chance to tell her side of the story. If she says she owns the car and claims she's a lawyer, shouldn't you at least verify her information before jumping to conclusions? Isn't that part of your duty?" Her words weren't loud, but they carried weight, a calm challenge wrapped in reason. Stephen's jaw tightened, his patience fraying like a worn thread. He turned back to Ashley, his glare sharpening into something almost predatory. "She claims to be a lawyer," he sneered, his voice dripping with skepticism. "But where's the proof? No identification, nothing. If she's so legitimate, why's she standing here empty-handed?" It was an accusation dressed as a question, a dare for Ashley to falter under his scrutiny. Ashley felt the heat of dozens of eyes boring into her as the crowd swelled around them. Some faces twisted with doubt, their brows raised in silent judgment, others softened with worry. Lips parted as if they wanted to speak but didn't dare. A few offered faint nods of encouragement, their sympathy a lifeline in this swelling sea of tension. The weight of their attention pressed down on her, a tangible force that made her chest tighten. This wasn't just about her anymore, it was about the principle of it, about being seen and heard. She scanned the onlookers, her mind racing. She'd worked too hard, fought too long, to let this moment define her as anything less than she was. A man in the crowd, his phone held high to capture every second, pushed closer, his voice rising above the murmurs. Hey, why not let her prove it? Check the car's plates or something. You can't just treat her like she's guilty because she doesn't have her ID on her right this second. His words crackled with indignation, a spark that ignited whispers of agreement among the others. Stephen's scowl deepened, his irritation morphing into something uglier as the crowd's stares bore into him like a spotlight. He couldn't escape. He wheeled back to Ashley, his tone unwavering, edged with defiance. She's acting suspicious, and she's got no ID. I don't need anyone telling me how to do my job. His voice boomed with authority, a wall he built to shield himself from their growing dissent. But beneath the harsh glare of the midday sun, Ashley felt a shift. The woman's steady presence, the man's bold recording, the quiet support flickering in the eyes of strangers wove a thread of courage through her. She wasn't alone in this. The middle-aged woman stepped closer, her gaze locking onto Stephen's with unflinching resolve before softening as she turned to Ashley. Gently, she rested a hand on Ashley's shoulder, her touch warm and grounding. You don't have to be afraid, she whispered, her voice a soothing balm against the chaos. We're here. We'll make sure this stays fair. Those words, simple yet resolute, washed over Ashley like a cool breeze, steadying the storm brewing inside her. For the first time since this ordeal began, she felt a flicker of calm, a quiet strength rising from the ashes of her frustration. Stephen, however, remained a statue of obstinacy. He flicked his eyes over the crowd, then back to Ashley, his stare darkening with a silent threat. He took a step closer, his voice dropping to a chilling growl. Say one more word, and I'll put you in the car. This is your last warning. The menace in his tone sent a shiver down Ashley's spine. But the crowd's unspoken support held her steady. She knew she was innocent, every fiber of her being screamed it. She thought of the years she'd spent clawing her way through law school, the late nights poring over books, the countless times she'd faced down prejudice with nothing but her wits and determination. Stephen's glare was just another echo of those old battles, and she refused to let it break her. The man with the phone edged nearer, his voice swelling with conviction. If you don't let her prove herself, you're the one breaking the rules here. You're supposed to uphold justice, not throw around baseless accusations. Stephen spun toward him, fury blazing in his eyes, but the crowd's murmur grew louder, a tide he couldn't hold back. For a fleeting moment, doubt flickered in his chest. He could feel the situation slipping from his grasp. If he pushed too hard, if he dragged Ashley away without cause, this could spiral into something he couldn't control. Yet his pride rooted him to the spot, his stance unyielding, his hand hovering near his handcuffs. Inside Ashley, a tempest churned, danger, exhaustion, and a bitter taste of injustice she'd fought against her whole life. But with the crowd behind her, their phones out, their voices rising, she drew herself up taller. She wasn't just a bystander in her own story anymore. Stephen's grip tightened on his cuffs, his knuckles whitening as he stepped toward her again. Stop pretending, he hissed, his voice low and venomous. Only someone with something to hide resists like this. But Ashley didn't waver. She met his gaze head-on, her own eyes blazing with a fire he hadn't anticipated. I've got nothing to hide, she said, her voice steady as steel, cutting through the thick air. But you'll have to answer for this in court. For a heartbeat, Stephen froze, caught off guard by the quiet power in her words. His stern mask slipped, just for a moment, before snapping back into place. Without another word, he seized her arm, his grip bruising as he yanked her toward the patrol car. The crowd gasped, a ripple of shock and disapproval spreading through them as he dragged her past their wide-eyed stares. Ashley stumbled but kept her head high, her heart pounding as she felt their eyesome horrified, some furious tracking her every step. When they reached the car, Stephen flung the door open, shoving her inside with a force that made her wince. She sank into the seat, the vinyl cold against her skin, and caught the fleeting glimpses of indignation on the faces outside. Phones were still rolling, voices rising in protest. Unbelievable, someone shouted, their tone thick with outrage. Doesn't he know who she is? Inside the car, Ashley fought to steady her breathing. her chest tight with a cocktail of frustration and hurt. She'd never pictured herself hair-crammed into a police car, treated like a criminal when she'd done nothing wrong. Her gaze locked onto Stephen as he slammed the door shut, a silent vow that she wouldn't let this slide. He rounded the car, his movements sharp and mechanical, but before he could climb in, another officer approached, his steps hesitant, his face creased with unease. "Stephen, are you sure about this?" he asked, his voice low and cautious. "She says she has ID." And taking her in without checking, he trailed off, glancing nervously at the crowd. Stephen's frown deepened, his hands slicing through the air to silence him. "Just do your job and let me handle this," he snapped, his tone a brittle shield against the doubt creeping in. The crowd didn't budge, their voices growing sharper, more insistent. "Let her go," someone yelled, while others demanded she be given a chance to prove herself. Stephen ignored them, slamming the driver's door shut as he slid behind the wheel. But beneath his stony exterior, a sliver of unease took root. Had he overstepped? Would this come back to haunt him? He shoved the thought down, starting the engine with a roar that drowned out the crowd's cries. As the car pulled away, Ashley sat rigid, her mind racing. She'd spent her career fighting for justice, and now she was its victim, a cruel twist that only steeled her resolve. At the station, the air was stale, the fluorescent lights casting harsh shadows down the long hallway. Curious eyes followed Ashley as Stephen marched her through, some whispering behind their hands, others offering fleeting looks of sympathy. A few recognized her as state attorney. No less but fear or apathy kept their lips sealed. Stephen's demeanor remained frigid as he shoved her into a cramped holding cell, the metal door clanging shut with a sound that reverberated in her bones. Alone in the stark, windowless room, Ashley stood still, staring at the door as a wave of indignation surged through her. The cold metal bench bit into her skin as she sat, her wrists still raw from the cuffs. Anger mingled with helplessness, a bitter brew she'd tasted before, but never like this. She'd seen injustice in courtrooms, argued against it, dismantled it, but to feel its weight on her own shoulders was a violation that cut deeper than she'd ever imagined. The irony wasn't lost on her. Years of tireless work, grueling exams, sleepless nights, battles against biassel to stand for what was right, only to end up here, locked away on a whim. The cell's confines amplified her frustration, the silence pressing in until it felt suffocating. But amid the turmoil, a spark ignited. She wasn't just a victim, she was a fighter, a voice for those crushed under the same abuses of power. If she didn't push back, who would? With a deep breath, she lifted her chin, her resolve hardening like tempered steel. This wasn't just about her anymore, it was about every soul who'd face this kind of senseless prejudice, and everyone who might still. After what felt like an eternity, a guard finally slid the door open, offering her a phone. Ashley didn't hesitate. She dialed George Lopez, her friend and a fellow attorney whose sharp mind and fierce loyalty she'd leaned on countless times. The line rang once, twice, before his deep, measured voice answered. "Ashley, what's going on?" There was a note of caution in his tone, but beneath it, a steady promise of support that eased the knot in her chest. She closed her eyes, letting his voice anchor her in the chaos, knowing that with George by her side, this fight was far from over. Ashley drew in a long, deliberate breath, her chest rising and falling as she fought to keep her voice steady, though the sharp edge of frustration cut through her words like a knife. "George, I'm at the police station," she said, each syllable heavy with disbelief. "They've arrested me on suspicion of car theft, they say." She paused, letting the absurdity of it sink in, then added with a bitter twist, "All because they caught me rummaging through my own car." Her fingers tightened around the phone, knuckles whitening as she pictured the scene again, the flashing lights, the cold metal of the handcuffs, the officers' smug faces as they ignored her protests. On the other end of the line, George fell silent for a heartbeat, the weight of her words settling over him like a storm cloud. When he spoke, his tone hardened, resolute and unyielding. "This is outrageous, Ashley. It's a textbook case of abuse of power, laced with prejudice. Are you okay? Did they lay a hand on you?" His voice carried a protective edge, the kind that came from years of knowing her, of standing by her side through thick and thin. Ashley clenched her jaw, her teeth grinding together as she forced herself to stay composed. The sterile smell of the station disinfectant mixed with stale coffee stung her nose, and the harsh fluorescent lights overhead buzzed faintly, amplifying her irritation. "I'm fine," she said, though the tremor in her voice betrayed her. "But I'm not letting this slide. George, this isn't just about me anymore, it's bigger than that. They need to face the consequences of what they've done." Her mind raced, replaying the moment the officer had smirked at her, dismissing her explanations as if she were invisible. It wasn't just an arrest, it was an attack on her dignity, her identity. George's response came swiftly, his conviction palpable even through the crackling phone line. "I figured you'd say that. Don't worry, I'm heading to the station right now. We'll fight this together. Do everything in our power to protect your rights and make them answer for this injustice." His words were a lifeline, pulling her back from the edge of despair. Ashley's shoulders relaxed slightly, a flicker of relief warming her chest. "Thank you, George," she murmured, her voice softening. "I knew I could count on you." "You're never alone in this, Ashley," George replied, his deep voice steady and unwavering. "This is our moment to set things right. Just hold, O'Neill'll be there soon." The call ended abruptly, but the mutual determination lingered in the air, a silent pact between them. Ashley lowered the phone, her dark eyes glinting with a renewed spark of hope. Standing there in the cold, gray holding area, she realized she wasn't facing this nightmare alone. She had allies, people who believed in her, ready to stand shoulder to shoulder in the battle for justice. Roughly 20 minutes later, the station's heavy glass doors swung open and George strode in, his presence commanding the room like a gust of wind scattering leaves. His brow was furrowed, his jaw set, and his eyes burned with purpose as they locked onto Ashley, still confined behind the desk with no rhyme or reason. The faint hum of conversation among the officers faltered as he approached the front counter, his polished shoes clicking against the linoleum floor. "I need to speak to the officer in charge of Ashley Johnson's detention," he demanded, his voice cutting through the stale air with undeniable authority. The receptionist flinched slightly, caught off guard by the intensity radiating from him. From a side office, Stephen emerged, his broad frame filling the doorway. His lips curled into a sneer as he sized up George, irritation flashing in his narrowed eyes. He didn't like Thistimione daring to challenge his control, to question the little kingdom he'd built within these walls. George didn't hesitate, stepping forward until they were mere feet apart, his posture rigid and unflinching. "I'm George Lopez, representing Ashley Johnson," he declared, his tone as solid as steel. "I demand you verify her identity and show me whatever evidence you think justifies holding her. Or are you telling me you didn't even bother to check her details before dragging her in here?" Stephen's eyebrow arched, a mocking glint in his eye as he crossed his arms over his chest. "She was acting suspicious," he drawled, his voice dripping with the same contempt he'd shown Ashley earlier. "No ID on her. That's all I need to bring someone in." He leaned slightly forward, as if his years of experience gave him the right to dismiss any critique. George's lips twitched into a scornful smirk. "Suspicious?" he cut in, his voice sharp enough to slice through Stephen's arrogance. "You locked her up based on a hunch, didn't check the license plate, didn't look at any paperwork, just jumped to conclusions. And now you're digging yourself a deeper hole. A quick verification would have told you everything you needed to know." His words hung in the air, a quiet indictment of Stephen's laziness and bias. Stephen's patience frayed, his icy blue eyes narrowing as he glared at George, trying to intimidate him with the weight of his stare. "I don't need some outsider telling me how to run my job," he snapped, his voice rising. "I've been doing this long enough to spot trouble when I see it." His hands balled into fists at his sides, the tension in his shoulders betraying his growing unease. George didn't flinch. Instead, he took a deliberate step closer, his gaze boring into Stephen's. "This isn't about your experience," he said, his voice low and deliberate, each word a hammer striking a nail. "It's about you trampling on a citizen's rights. You didn't verify anything, no ID check, no plate lookup, no procedure at all. You saw a black woman searching her own car and decided she was guilty. That's not instinct, that's prejudice. That's abuse of power." His accusation landed like a thunderclap, reverberating through the station. The room grew still, the other officers pausing mid-task, their heads turning toward the confrontation. Some shifted uncomfortably, their boots scuffing the floor, while others exchanged furtive glances. The unease thick in the air. Then the door to the chief's office creaked open, and Chief Carl Lewis stepped out, his presence a quiet storm of authority. Middle-aged, with salt and pepper hair and a face etched with years of hard decisions, he carried himself with a calm that belied the sharpness in his hazel eyes. He surveyed the Synedrich's defiant stance, Stephen's bristling anger, the nervous energy rippling through his staff before fixing his gaze on Stephen. "What's happening here, Stephen?" he asked, his deep voice steady but laced with a warning. "I've got a report we're holding someone without solid evidence. Explain." Stephen faltered, his confidence cracking under the chief's scrutiny. He straightened, trying to salvage his dignity. "She didn't have ID, and she was acting suspicious," he said, though his tone wavered. "I had every reason to detain her." His eyes darted to the side, avoiding Carl's piercing stare. George seized the opening, his voice firm but measured. "She identified herself as a state attorney and the car's owner." Stephen didn't bother to check her story or the license plate. He leaned on his own judgment as bias and locked her up anyway. "That's not policing. That's abuse of power." His words were a spotlight, illuminating the cracks in Stephen's defense. Chief Carl's expression darkened, his lips pressing into a thin line as he turned back to Stephen. "Is this true? You didn't verify the plate or anything else?" His tone was calm, but the undercurrent of disappointment was unmistakable. Stephen's face flushed, his eyes dropping to the floor as he mumbled, "She didn't have ID. I couldn't just trust her word." His defiance was crumbling, replaced by a sullen resentment. George exhaled sharply, his frustration spilling over. "You didn't need to trust her word, Stephen. You could have run the plate, called her officito on the bare minimum. But you didn't, because of who she is. That's not just a mistake, it's a violation." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. "It's unacceptable." The chief nodded slowly, his sharp gaze still locked on Stephen. "If she's a state attorney, and there's no evidence of a crime, we've got no grounds to hold her," he said, his voice firm. "Stephen, this is a serious misstep." He turned to George, his demeanor shifting to one of respect. "Mr. Lopez, I apologize for this mess. We'll release Miss Johnson immediately and look into this thoroughly." George gave a curt nod, the tension in his face easing just a fraction. "I hope it's more than a look," he replied, his tone still edged with steel. "Actions like Stephen's can't happen again. This isn't a slip-up, it's a deliberate breach of her rights. Justice demands accountability." Carl inclined his head, his expression grave. He gestured to the officers nearby, who scrambled to unlock the holding cell. The metal door clanged open, and George stepped inside, offering Ashley his hand. She took it, her fingers trembling slightly as she rose, her eyes meeting his with a gratitude that needed no words. Without him, she might have been trapped in this nightmare for hours longer, her voice silenced, her rights ignored. The chief approached her, his broad shoulders squared, but his face softened with sincerity. "Miss Johnson," he said, his voice low and earnest, "I'm deeply sorry for what's happened here. This never should have occurred. We'll investigate fully and ensure those responsible are held accountable." His words carried weight, a promise born from the realization that this wasn't just a personal slight, it was a stain on his department's integrity. Ashley met his gaze, her chin lifting as determination flickered through her exhaustion. "Thank you, Chief Lewis," she said, her voice steady despite the lingering ache in her chest. "But this isn't a one-off. Too many people have faced this kind of treatment. Accountability has to mean something. It's the only way things change." Her words were a quiet challenge, a call for justice that stretched beyond her own story. Carl nodded, respect deepening in his eyes. Then he turned to Stephen, who stood rigid, his face a mask of barely concealed fury. "Stephen, you're suspended, effective immediately," Carl declared, his tone unwavering. "We'll investigate your actions. They point to serious violations of civil rights. This isn't how we serve justice." Stephen's jaw tightened, a flush of shame and anger creeping up his neck. He bit his lip, his gaze shifting away. But the resentment simmering beneath his silence was palpable. Around them, The station buzzed with quiet unrest. Younger officers clustered in corners, their voices hushed but sharp with frustration. Jake, a lanky rookie with a mop of brown hair, leaned toward Lucy, his partner, his brow furrowed. "Steven's always been like this," he muttered, his tone thick with disgust. "Judging people on sight, skipping the rules. He thinks he's above it all." Lucy, her dark curls pulled back tightly, nodded, her eyes thoughtful as she watched Steven stew. "He's got that bias baked in," she whispered. "I've seen him pull this kind of thing before on fair stops, snap decisions. But no one calls him out. If Ashley weren't who she is, this might have stayed buried." Their words echoed a broader discontent rippling through the younger ranks. They'd watched Steven wield his seniority like a club, bending procedures to fit his prejudices, and they'd bitten their tongues, fearing the fallout. Now, with his suspension laid bare, the air crackled with a mix of relief and unease. Carl caught the sidelong glances, the whispered gripes, and felt the fracture in his team, a divide between those hungry for fairness and the old guard clinging to unchecked power. He sighed, the weight of leadership pressing down on him. This wasn't just about Steven. It was a chance to root out a deeper rot. Turning to the room, he raised his voice, warm yet firm. "I know you all see this differently, but we're here to uphold justice and not to wield power like it's ours to abuse. What happened today shows us where we've failed, and it's on us to fix it." His words hung in the air, a quiet vow to rebuild trust, to ensure that justice wasn't just a word, but a lived reality. For Ashley and George, standing side by side as they left the station, the ordeal was a stark lesson: power, unchecked, bred injustice. But in its wake, it also forged Risalvi a reminder that the fight for what's right was worth every step, every stand, every consequence. The air in the police station hung heavy that day, thick with tension and unspoken thoughts. As Chief Carl stood before his officers, his voice carried a steady weight, deliberate and clear, as he addressed the room. "Here in this department, fairness and responsibility must always come first, above egos, above assumptions, above everything. If any of you have grievances, worries, or even ideas about how we can do better, my door is wide open." His words lingered, settling into the minds of the younger officers scattered around the room. Some exchanged quick glances, their eyes flickering with a mix of hope and hesitation. A few nodded subtly, comforted by the chief's promise of openness, their shoulders loosening as if a small burden had lifted. Yet, beneath that thin layer of reassurance, an undercurrent of unease rippled through them. They all knew Steven wasn't the only one bending rules or letting personal biases guide his badge. Changing something so deeply woven into the fabric of their world would take far more than a single speech or a slap on the wrist. Carl's gaze shifted, landing squarely on Steven, who stood rigid near the back. The chief's tone hardened, his words cutting through the room like a blade. "You need to grasp this, Steven. Fairness and transparency aren't just buzzwords, they're the bedrock of what we do. You threw both out the window when you didn't bother to check Miss Johnson's story." Steven's face flushed a deep crimson, anger simmering beneath his skin as he felt the weight of every stare in the room, pinning him in place. His jaw tightened, but no words came. He couldn't argue, not when the truth of his actions, set so plainly before him, had let prejudice steer his every move. In that encounter, without a sound, he turned sharply on his heel and stormed out, the door swinging shut behind him with a hollow thud. The younger officers watched him go, their expressions a mix of disappointment and quiet judgment, their eyes tracing the path of a man who'd just walked away from their respect. Ashley stood a few steps away, her arms crossed tightly over her chest, her brow furrowed as she took in the scene. The division in the room was palpably fracture splitting the force between those who clung to old ways and those who ached for something better. Her heart pounded with a fierce resolve, her mind racing with the faces of others who'd been dismissed or mistreated like she had. This wasn't just about her anymore. She turned to George, her voice low but steady, brimming with a quiet fire. "We can't let this be the end, George. Too many people have been hurt by the same kind of injustice I went through today. We have to push for something real, something that lasts." George met her gaze, his own eyes alight with a matching determination, the lines on his face deepening with the weight of her words. "You're right, "Ashley, this isn't just your fight, it's ours. It's a chance to fix the system, to make it fair for everyone. We're just getting started." His nod was firm, a silent pact forming between them in that fleeting moment. Chief Carl caught the tail end of their exchange, his expression softening into something thoughtful, almost pensive. He stood there, hands clasped behind his back, the faint creases around his eyes deepening as he mulled over their words. He knew building a department rooted in justice would take more than his authority alone. It would need voices like Ashley's, like George's, like the young officers now shifting restlessly in the corner, people willing to stand up, to call out what was wrong, even when it was uncomfortable. But he also understood the enormity of the task ahead. Shifting the culture of an entire police force wasn't a quick fix. It was a battle against years of entrenched habits and unspoken loyalties. His jaw tightened with resolve as he made his way toward the cluster of younger officers. Jake, Lucy, and a handful of other SWO stood huddled together, their faces a mix of uncertainty and cautious hope. "Jake, Lucy, all of you," Carl began, his voice warm but firm. "If there's anything weighing on you, challenges you see, problems you face in your work, you want to hear it. We can't move forward if we keep sweeping these things under the rug. Speak up." The group exchanged tentative looks, the air between them thick with hesitation. Jake rubbed the back of his neck, his brow furrowing as he wrestled with his nerves. Finally, he stepped forward, his voice trembling at first but growing steadier with each word. "Chief, there's a lot here that needs fixing. We want a department where everyone gets a fair shake, where professionalism isn't just a word we throw around. The way power gets twisted, the biases that sneak in, it's been eating away at what we're supposed to stand for, at the trust people have in us." Lucy stepped up beside him, her arms crossed, her chin lifted defiantly. "We're tired of standing by while people get hurt by unfair treatment. We want to do this job right, with our heads held high. And that means changing the whole system, not just pointing fingers at one person." Carl listened, his head tilted slightly, his eyes locked on theirs with a quiet respect. He could see it now, the spark of something new flickering in their words, in the way they stood a little taller. Around the room, other young officers watched, their own silent hopes mirrored in the exchange. "You'll all get your chance to shape this place," Carl said, his voice carrying a promise. "I'm committed to hearing you, to making this better, together." The tension in the station seemed to ease, like a storm cloud slowly drifting away. For the first time in a long while, the younger officers felt a flicker of optimism, a sense that Ashley's ordeal might be the catalyst for something bigger, something that could rewrite the rules they'd all been bound by. They glanced at Carl with a cautious trust, daring to believe this could mark the start of a new chapter in their careers, one grounded in fairness and accountability. As Ashley and George stepped out into the crisp evening air, the weight of the day clung to them like damp clothes. The road ahead stretched long and daunting, paved with obstacles they couldn't yet see. But deep in their cores, a quiet certainty burned. They'd struck a match today, and the light of truth was beginning to spread. Behind them, Carl lingered at the station's entrance, watching their silhouettes fade into the dusk. His chest tightened with a silent vow. He'd do whatever it took to protect the principles he'd built his life around, to ensure justice wasn't just a hollow promise. The internal investigation that followed was exhaustive, a meticulous unraveling of every thread in Ashley's case. A team of both department insiders and independent overseers pored over every detail, statements, grainy video footage, even the hastily scrawled reports Stephen had filed. The evidence piled up, undeniable and stark. Stephen hadn't just skipped protocol. He'd let his biases run the show. Instead of confirming Ashley's identity, a basic step any officer worth their salt would take, had sized her up in an instant, his judgment clouded by her appearance, her circumstances, her very existence in his line of sight. Facts hadn't mattered to him, his gut had been enough. That reckless arrogance had spiraled into an incident that didn't just wound Ashley, it gouged a fresh scar into the department's already battered reputation. When the findings were laid bare, Chief Carl faced the public at a press conference, the weight of the moment etched into every line of his face. The room buzzed with reporters, their cameras flashing like impatient stars. His voice was grave, steady, as he addressed the crowd. Bias and abuse of power have no home in this police force. What happened here didn't just hurt those directly involved in it. Chipped away at the faith people have in us. This is a hard lesson, one that reminds us all. Justice has to stand on solid ground, on fairness and reason, not on whims or prejudice. The decision was clear: Stephen was out, terminated effective immediately. Alongside that, Carl announced a new initiative: mandatory bias awareness and sensitivity training for every officer under his command. The room was silent for a beat, the weight of his words sinking in. It wasn't a shock, but it landed like a gavel, a stark warning of the standards they were all held to, the consequences of forgetting them. That same day, Stephen sat alone in his office, the space around him feeling alien, hollowed out. The walls, once a gallery of his prized certificates, awards, framed commendations, loomed like relics of a life that no longer fit. His desk was a mess of open files, papers spilling over the edges, but his hands stayed idle, too heavy to move. Over half his life had been poured into this career, and now it lay in ruins, crumbled by a single, glaring misstep. Regret crept into his mind, slow and cold, seeping into every corner of his thoughts. He replayed the scene with Ashley over and over, the way he'd narrowed his eyes at her, the sharp edge in his voice, the clink of the handcuffs as he'd snapped them on without a second thought. He'd known, even then, that he was off the mark, but only now, with everything stripped away, did the full scope of his failure hit him. He'd become someone he didn't recognize, tangled in a web of power and snap judgments. His once trusted instinctuous knack for reading people revealed as the flaws that had undone him. The door creaked open, and Carl stepped inside, his presence filling the room with a quiet authority. His face was stern, but there was a flicker of something softer sorrow, maybe for the man he'd worked beside for decades. "Stephen, we've made our call," Carl said, his voice steady but laced with a faint ache. "You're done here, effective now. This comes from repeated lapses in profession conduct, abuse of power. Your time served doesn't change that. We can't let this slide." Stephen looked up, his eyes hollow, brimming with a storm of despair and defiance. He opened his mouth, grasping for something anything to say. "Carl, I messed up. I let my biases take over. I see that now. But I didn't think it'd blow up like this." His words stumbled out, weak and unsteady. Carl held his gaze, unflinching. "Our job isn't to play judge based on hunches or feelings. You've had warnings, chances to turn it around. You didn't, and now, those choices have caught up with you." Silence swallowed the room as Carl turned and left, his footsteps fading down the hall. Stephen sank into his chair, the weight of his past pressing down on him. It wasn't just Ashley, there'd been others. Countless moments where he'd let suspicion override reason, where he'd wielded his badge like a gavel instead of a shield. He'd dodged the fallout before, but not this time. The clarity of it stung, sharp and unrelenting. He'd lost more than his job, had lost the trust of the people he'd once stood beside. And the isolation of that truth was a cold, unyielding ache. When he finally walked out, his belongings stuffed into a small box under his arm, the station buzzed faintly with the hum of daily work. Eyes followed him, some curious, some icy, none warm. Jake and Lucy stood off to the side, their heads tilted together in quiet conversation. As Stephen passed, Jake's gaze flicked up, hard and unyielding. "That's what happens when you let power go to your head," he muttered to Lucy, loud enough for Stephen to catch. Lucy nodded, her lips pressed into a thin line, her eyes tracking Stephen's retreat with a mix of relief and resolve. They saw it clear as day. His fall was a reckoning, a brutal reminder that justice demanded more than authority, it demanded integrity. Stephen kept walking, the weight of their judgment settling into his bones, a final echo of the lesson he'd learned too late. Power unchecked was a path to ruin, and justice, when ignored, always found a way to balance the scales. The air in the police station was thick with tension as Lucy leaned closer to Jake, her voice a low murmur laced with conviction. "I hope this sticks in the minds of anyone who thinks power is all that matters," she said, just loud enough for Stephen to catch her words as he trudged past. Her eyes, sharp and unyielding, followed him, reflecting a deep well of disappointment that had been simmering for months. Lucy, still green in her role as an officer, had entered the force with a heart full of ideals, fairness, integrity, a belief that the badge she wore meant something noble. Jake, standing beside her, gave a slow nod, his own gaze mirroring hers. Like Lucy, he was new to this world, a young man who had once dreamed of upholding justice, only to find himself repeatedly disillusioned by the likes of Stephen and others, who wielded their authority like a blunt weapon. Stephen's footsteps echoed heavily down the long, dimly lit corridors of the precinct, a place he had poured years of his life into. Each step felt like a journey through a fractured existence, as though he were straddling the realms of memory, the other of harsh reality. In his mind's eye, he could still see himself as that eager rookie all those years ago, his uniform crisp and his spirit ablaze with a passion for righteousness. He'd believed in the system then, trusted it to be a force for good, but somewhere along the way, that fire had dimmed, snuffed out by the creeping shadows of power and prejudice. Now, as he walked these familiar halls for what might be the last time, regret gnawed at him, bitter and unrelenting. The station, once a second home where he'd laughed with colleagues and logged endless nights on duty, seemed to loom over him now, its walls whispering accusations. Pausing at the entrance, Stephen turned to take in the sight one final time. The chipped paint on the doorframe, the faint hum of the fluorescent lights overhead, the distant clatter of a typewriter, it all flooded back. His first assignment flashed before him, a petty theft case he'd cracked with pride, earning a slap on the back from his sergeant. Then came the late nights, the coffee-stained reports, the camaraderie that had once made this place feel alive, but those memories felt distant now, like faded photographs in a dusty album. He wasn't just leaving behind a job, he was abandoning the man he'd once been, the one who'd sworn to protect and serve. As the door swung shut behind him with a dull thud, the finality of it hit him hard. He'd lost more than a career. He'd lost his honor, his self-respect, and the trust of those who'd once called him a brother in arms. Word of Stephen's dismissal rippled through the station like a stone dropped into still water. For the younger officers, Jake, Lucy, and a handful of others, it was as if a suffocating weight had finally lifted. They gathered in the break room, their voices hushed but alive with a cautious optimism. "It's about time," Jake muttered, running a hand through his dark hair, his brow furrowed with the exhaustion of holding onto hope. Lucy leaned against the counter, arms crossed, her lips curling into a faint, satisfied smile. To them, Stephen had been more than just a thorn in their side. He'd been a living symbol of everything wrong with the force, arrogance, corruption, the casual abuse of power that had tainted their shared mission. His exit wasn't a cure-all. They knew that. The road to a cleaner, fairer department stretched out long and treacherous before them. But it was a start, a fragile glimmer of possibility that justice might one day prevail. Across the station, Ashley and George caught wind of the news over a crackling radio in the evidence room. Ashley, her auburn hair pulled back tightly, let out a slow breath, her hazel eyes glinting with a mix of relief and resolve. George, older and gruff, with lines etched deep into his weathered face, gave a curt nod. They'd both seen this coming. Stephen's downfall had been inevitable. After Ashley's case exposed his overreach, there was a quiet satisfaction in knowing that justice had, for once, tipped the scales in their favor. Yet neither of them was naive enough to think the battle was won. Ashley's ordelphously accused, her name dragged through the mud by Stephen's vendetta, was just one thread in a sprawling tapestry of wrongs. Changing the system would demand more than a single victory. It would take unrelenting grit, a fight that would stretch far beyond this moment. For them, this was a spark, not the fire's end. For Stephen, the consequences cut deeper than the loss of his badge. As he stepped out into the biting chill of the empty street, the wind tugging at his coat, he felt the weight of his unraveling life settle into his bones. His honor was gone, stripped away by his own hands. The respect he'd once commanded from peers had evaporated, replaced by averted gazes and whispered judgments. Self-respect, too, had slipped through his fingers, leaving behind a hollow shell of the man he'd thought he was. He replayed the choices that had led him here, letting bias twist his judgment, wielding his authority to settle personal scores. Admitting it now couldn't erase the past, but it forced him to confront a truth he'd buried. Fairness mattered. It was a principle he'd forsaken, and the cost had been his own destruction. The street stretched out before him, gray and desolate, a mirror to the ruin he'd made of himself. He'd hurt others, yes, but in the end, his prejudices had devoured his own life. Back at the station, Stephen's departure sent a ripple of change through the ranks. Chief Carl, a towering figure with a voice like gravel, stood in his office, staring out the window as the news sank in. He'd known the department was flawed, riddled with cracks that men like Stephen had widened. The younger Officerstjake with his quiet determination, Lucy with her fierce moral compass saw this as a turning point, a chance to rebuild from the inside. They gathered in the briefing room, their voices rising with ideas, better training, stricter oversight, a purge of the biases that had festered too long. For them, justice wasn't just a word, it was a mission, one they'd fight for with every ounce of their being. Ashley, though, saw beyond the precinct's walls. Her fight had never been just about clearing her name, or seeing Stephen fully. It was about the countless others who'd suffered in silence. Standing in her small apartment that night, she stared at the papers strewn across her table, notes, plans, a vision taking shape. She wouldn't stop here. Her pain, her humiliation at Stephen's hands, could fuel something bigger. The next morning, she booked a modest community hall, her hands trembling with a mix of nerves and purpose as she set up chairs. She expected a handful of people, maybe 20, if she was lucky. But when she arrived, the room was overflowing. Men and women of all ages packed the space, some standing shoulder to shoulder along the peeling walls, others cradling children or clutching worn notebooks. Teenagers with defiant expressions sat beside professionals in pressed suits, all drawn by a shared hunger for change. Stepping onto the rickety stage, Ashley felt her chest tighten, a wave of emotion crashing over her. She took a deep breath, her voice steadying as she began to speak. She laid bare her story of false accusations, the abuse of power, the nights she'd cried herself to sleep wondering if justice was a lie. Her words poured out, raw and unfiltered, each one striking a chord with the crowd. They leaned forward, eyes locked on her, as if she were voicing the pain they'd carried in secret. "This isn't just about me," she said, her gaze sweeping the room. "It's about every one of you who's been judged, dismissed, or hurt because of someone else's prejudice. We can change this together." Silence hung heavy for a heartbeat. Then the room erupted. The applause wasn't polite. It was a roar, a thunderous wave of support that shook the walls and sent a shiver down her spine. One by one, they came forward. Maria, a middle-aged woman with tired eyes, spoke of the officer who'd sneered at her beat-up car, treating her like a criminal for daring to drive it. Kevin, a young man with calloused hands, recounted the humiliation of being searched on his walk home, his only crime being the color of his skin. Then there was Mr. Walter, a gray-haired veteran whose voice broke as he described his baseless detention, his medals at home mocked by the suspicion in an officer's eyes. "I fought for this country's justice," he said, tears streaking his face, "and now I'm fighting for my own." His resilience pierced the room, binding them all in a shared resolve. The stories wove together, a tapestry of grief and defiance, and Ashley felt the weight of her purpose grow. This wasn't her fight anymore, it was theirs. From that night, Ashley's movement took root. She organized more forums, traveling to neighboring towns, each meeting bursting with voices eager to be heard. The stories were recorded, shared online, and soon the internet buzzed with thousands of reaction support, outrage, hope. Lawyers stepped up, offering free counsel to victims. Civil rights groups launched workshops, arming people with knowledge of their rights. Ashley founded Voices for Justice, a non-profit that became a life legal aid, counseling, a beacon for those the system had failed. Even Chief Carl couldn't ignore the tide. At first, he'd bristled, fearing the scrutiny would tarnish his force. But after attending a forum, hearing the raw honesty in those voices, he softened. Standing before the crowd, he pledged reform training, transparency, a partnership with the community to hold his department accountable. It wasn't just words, it was a vow, one the people embraced with wary trust. Stephen, meanwhile, faded into the shadows of his own making. Each night, as he sat alone in his cramped apartment, the silence pressed in, heavy with the lessons he'd learned too late. Power had been his idol, and it had betrayed him. he hoped had prayed. Event that his fall might serve as a warning, a stark reminder that justice, when ignored, exacts its own price. For Ashley and her growing legion, his story was a footnote in a larger saga. Their quiet revolution swelled, a testament to the truth that power unchecked breeds ruin, while justice, fought for, can heal a broken world. In the heart of a restless city, where the hum of life pulsed through every street and alley, a movement was taking root. It began with Ashley, a woman whose quiet strength belied the fire within her, a fire kindled by years of witnessing unfairness and fueled by a deep yearning to see justice prevail. She stood among a growing crowd, their faces a mosaic of determination and hope, each person carrying their own tale of struggle. As the sun dipped below the skyline, casting long shadows over the gathering, more voices joined the chorus. Ordinary citizens, weary of a system that too often turned a blind eye, and even a handful of young police officers, their badges gleaming faintly in the twilight. These officers weren't the hardened enforcers of old. They were wide-eyed and eager, drawn to Ashley's vision like moths to a flame. They wanted to be part of something bigger, something that didn't just uphold the law but reshaped it into a shield for the vulnerable, rather than a cudgel for the powerful. For these young officers, the movement was a revelation. They joined the force with ideals tucked beneath their crisp uniforms, only to find those dreams dulled by the grind of routine and the weight of unspoken expectations. But now, standing shoulder to shoulder with the community, they felt a shift deep within. They weren't just cogs in a machine anymore. They were protectors of justice, capital letters etched into their souls. Every story shared around the circle, every trembling voice that rose above the murmur of the crowd, stitched them closer to the people they'd sworn to serve. They listened to a shopkeeper recount how a false accusation had nearly cost him his livelihood, his hands twisting nervously as he spoke. They heard a mother's choked sobs as she described her son's wrongful arrest, her eyes glistening with a mix of pain and defiance. Each tale was a thread, weaving a tapestry of solidarity that bound them all together. And with every thread, the movement grew stronger, its roots sinking deeper into the cracked pavement of their city. Ashley stood at the center of it all, her presence steady yet electric. She knew this was only the beginning of a fragile sprout pushing through stony soil. The path ahead stretched out like an endless highway, winding through obstacles she couldn't yet see. Real change, she understood, was a slow burn, not a sudden blaze. It demanded patience, persistence, and the courage to keep moving forward even when the wind pushed back. But with every step she took, with every story she gathered like a precious stone, and with every person she lifted from despair, the dream inched closer, a society where fairness wasn't a privilege doled out to the fortunate few, but a right claimed by all, no matter their name, their roots, or the hue of their skin. As she looked out over the sea of facem weathered by hardship, others alight with newfound purpose, Ash felt a seismic shift within herself. She was no longer just a lone woman tilting at windmills. She was a piece of something vast, a cornerstone in a transformation that would echo through time, a living testament to the unyielding hunger for justice and equality. The movement's momentum carried it beyond the streets and into the corridors of power. After months of relentless effort, nights spent drafting proposals, days rallying support, Ashley's work caught the eye of Chief Carl, a grizzled veteran whose stern exterior hid a grudging respect for her tenacity. One crisp morning, he summoned her to his office, the air thick with the scent of stale coffee and the faint buzz of fluorescent lights. He slid an envelope across his cluttered desk, his voice gruff but earnest. "We're forming an internal oversight committee to steer reforms in the department," he said, his eyes locking with hers. "I want you on it not as a figurehead, but as someone with real sway. You'll help shape policies, oversee training, keep us honest." It wasn't a ceremonial gesture. It was a call to action, a chance to wield authority in a system that had once dismissed her cries. Ashley didn't leap at the offer. Instead, she asked for a meeting in the chief's office, but in a cramped conference room at the station, where the walls seemed to lean in as if to listen. She faced Carl and the committee members, a mix of seasoned bureaucrats and wary officers, their expressions ranging from curiosity to skepticism. Standing tall, her hands clasped tightly to steady the tremor of nerves, She met their gazes with unflinching resolve. "I'll take the role," she began, her voice cutting through the room like a blade. "But on one condition. I'm not here to warm a seat or nod at hollow promises. I want real change, tangible commitments, open books, no shadows where corruption can hide. I speak for the community, for every soul who's been crushed by injustice. And if I catch even a whiff of a cover-up or negligence, I'll shout it from the rooftops." Her words hung heavy in the air, a challenge and a vow. The room fell silent, the weight of her conviction pressing against every chest. Some shifted uncomfortably, unused to such raw honesty. Others stared, wide-eyed, as if seeing her for the first time. Carl's lips twitched into a faint smile, a rare crack in his stony facade. "That's exactly why we need you, Ashley," he said, his tone softening with a warmth that surprised even him. "We need someone who'll call it like it is, who won't let us slide back into old habits." With that, Ashley stepped into her role, a mantle she wore with both caution and ferocity. She dove into the work, undeterred by the resistance that simmered beneath the surface-grumbled complaints from officers who saw her as an outsider, sit-along glances from administrators who feared her scrutiny. Every Tuesday, she sat at a long oak table with the committee, poring over reform proposals, dissecting every word, every loophole. She wasn't just a watchdog. She was a voice for the hundreds who'd pinned their hopes on her, their trust a quiet fire that kept her going. One of her first moves was bold, mandatory training for every officer, not just on laws and tactics, but on the hidden currents of bias and the art of keeping a cool head under pressure. "Officers need to see the people behind the cases," she argued during a heated meeting, her voice steady despite the tension crackling around her. "Bias isn't just a word, it's a lens that distorts judgment. We've all seen the fallout, from my story to countless others. If we don't dig out the root, we're just slapping paint over rot to make it stick." She pushed for outside experts, psychologists, and bias specialists to lead the sessions, not internal trainers who might soften the edges to keep the peace. The pushback was immediate, a chorus of grumbles about meddling outsiders. But Ashley leaned on the community's swelling support and the media's watchful eye, until the proposal passed, a hard-won victory etched in sweat and determination. She didn't stop there. Ashley turned her sights on the complaint process, a labyrinth where grievances too often vanished into silence. She proposed an independent review board, citizens and experts, not just cops policing their own, to handle every claim, ensuring no case was buried under a rug of loyalty or fear. "People deserve to speak without trembling," she said, her eyes flashing as she addressed the committee. "They need to know their voices won't be drowned out or punished. That starts with transparency, Absol, unshakable transparency." Her presence rippled through the department like a stone dropped into still water, stirring up accountability where complacency once reigned. Processes opened up, inch by inch, sunlight piercing through cracks that had long been sealed shut. The culture shifted too slowly, unevenly, but unmistakably. Young officers like Daniel, who'd once bowed to the barked orders of men like Sergeant Stephen, found their spines. They began to question, to push back, their voices tentative at first but growing bolder with each meeting, each small win. Beyond the station's walls, Ashley's movement blossomed. Monthly gatherings sprang up in community centers, church basements, even empty lots where the wind carried whispers of hope. She stood before crowds, her notepad worn and ink-stained, listening as people poured out their hearts. There was Miguel, a mechanic whose accent had marked him as suspicious in the eyes of a patrolman, his pride still stinging from a baseless search. There was Lena, a teacher whose brother had been roughed up for looking wrong, her anger tempered by a fierce resolve to see things change. Each story was a brick in the foundation Ashley was building, a reminder that this wasn't her fight alone. One evening, in a small church with peeling paint and creaking pews, an elderly woman named Rosa shuffled to the front. Her hands trembled as she gripped the microphone, her voice cracking as she spoke of decades spent shrinking under the weight of discrimination. Her skin to dark, her years too many. Tears carved paths down her weathered cheeks as she recalled being dismissed, belittled, invisible. When she finished, the room was still, the air thick with shared sorrow. Ashley crossed the floor in 3 strides, wrapping Rosa in a hug that spoke louder than words. Your story won't fade into the dark, she whispered, her voice fierce with promise. I'll fight until the future looks different for you, for all of us. Rose's frail frame seemed to grow taller in that embrace, and the crowd's faith in Ashley deepened. A bond forged in tears and tenacity. Months rolled into years, and the reforms took hold fragile at first, like new shoots after a long winter, but growing stronger with time. Training sessions reshaped how officers saw their roles. The review board brought a measure of trust where suspicion once festered. Yet Ashley knew this was no finish line, just a milestone on a marathon that demanded endurance. Justice wasn't a gift bestowed in a single stroke. It was a garden cultivated through sweat, vigilance, and the will to stand together. One evening, after a grueling meeting finalizing the complaint system, she stepped outside with George, a steadfast ally whose quiet wisdom had steadied her through storms. The city sprawled before them, its lights twinkling like stars against the night, each one a silent plea for fairness. They stood on the station steps, the cool air brushing their faces. A rare moment of stillness after the chaos. George's hand rested on her shoulder, heavy with pride. You're not just fighting for yourself anymore, Ashley, he said, his voice low and rich. You're lighting a fire in Pia Plenside these walls and out there in the streets. Ashley's eyes traced the horizon, her mind drifting to a world where justice wasn't a battle, but a birthright. I want fairness to be the air we breathe, she murmured, not a dream we have to claw for. A place where no one fears the law because it stands for them, not against them. George nodded, his smile faint but warm. That's why we keep going. These reforms, the training, it's a start. But we'll need to guard it, nurture it, make it last. They lingered there, the city's heartbeat thrumming beneath their feet, their resolve mirrored in each other's eyes. Behind them, a crowd gathered, faces once scarred by betrayal, now alight with purpose. Ashley turned to George, her gaze blazing. Together, she said, we'll keep pushing for them, for everyone who needs a shield. For a world where power answers to justice. Side by side, they stepped forward, carrying the weight of their community's trust, the strength of their shared vision, and a promise to a generation yet to come. The road stretched on, shadowed and steep, but they walked it undaunted, fueled by a truth as old as time. When power forgets its purpose, it sows the seeds of its own reckoning and justice. Though slow, will always rise to claim its due. Marcus Thompson stood before the smudged bathroom mirror, his fingers trembling slightly as they worked to straighten the plain black tie around his neck. The reflection staring back at him was a far cry from the man he'd grown accustomed to seeing. Over the years, no crisp, tailored FBI suit clung to his frame today. Instead, he wore a pair of unremarkable khakis and a simple blue button-down shirt, the kind you'd pluck off a rack at Target without a second thought. These were clothes carefully chosen to erase the sharp edges of his identity, to soften him into just another face in the crowd, a middle-class black man, navigating the streets of Millbrook City. At 35, Marcus had spent 12 years honing his craft as one of the FBI's most adept undercover agents. His name whispered with respect in the halls of the Bureau. But this time, as he smoothed the wrinkles from his shirt, a knot of unease tightened in his chest. This wasn't just another mission to snare a criminal in a web of evidence. This one cut deeper, threading through the marrow of his personal history, stirring emotions he'd long learned to bury beneath a mask of professionalism. 3 days earlier, the call had come from his supervisor, Agent Sarah Chen. The memory of that late evening lingered vividly in his mind, the way she'd summoned him to her office, the soft click of the door sealing them inside a space thick with unspoken urgency. Sarah was a woman of precision, her dark eyes steady and unflinching, but that night, Marcus had caught the faintest tremor in her voice. "You're the best person for this job, Thompson," she'd said, her words heavy with conviction as she slid a stack of files across her desk. The papers fanned out before him, each one a testament to years of whispered complaints about the Millbrook Police Department, stories of racial profiling, evidence planted like seeds in fertile soil, arrests built on lies that crumbled under scrutiny, yet somehow never led to justice. "We've been chasing shadows for too long," Sarah had continued, her fingers tapping the edge of a particularly thick dossier. "Victims won't talk, they are too afraid, or the evidence vanishes before we can pin it down." Marcus had nodded, his jaw tight, already piecing together the puzzle she was laying out. The files beneath his hands were a gallery of broken lives. A black doctor, weary from a night shift, hauled from his car in cuffs. A college student, visiting his grandmother, detained on a fabricated charge. A real estate agent, mid-tour with a client, dragged away in handcuffs while stunned homeowners watched from their manicured lawns. The culprits were no mystery. Two names surfaced again and again in the reports: Officers James Barrett and Michael Reynolds. Their tactics were as predictable as they were sinister, targeting black drivers in the city's wealthiest enclaves, conducting searches that bordered on assault, and miraculously uncovering drugs in the vehicles of those who dared to question their authority. Marcus had flipped through the photos, his pulse quickening with each face that stared back at him, each story a mirror to the indignities his own community had endured for generations. "How long have they been getting away with this?" he'd asked, his voice a low rumble, anger simmering just beneath the surface. Sarah's answer had been a quiet blade. "Too long. But they're getting careless now." Their last target was the teenage son of a city council member. Clean record, no history. Yet they pinned possession on him. The father's outrage finally gave us the leverage we needed to move. Now, standing in his modest bathroom, Marcus checked his hidden gear with meticulous care. The cameras were marvels of subtlety, a tiny lens tucked into his tie clip, another nestled in the face of his watch, a third peering from the rearview mirror of his car. His phone, a lifeline to the FBI's secure server, was rigged to upload every second of footage automatically. The plan was straightforward yet perilous. For the next few weeks, he'd cruise the polished streets of Millbrook's richest neighborhoods, tracing the routes where Barrett and Reynolds prowled like wolves. He'd break no laws, give them no legitimate cause to stop him, but their history promised they wouldn't need one. His new identity was watertight: Marcus Williams, freelance IT consultant, freshly settled into a nondescript apartment on the city's edge. The FBI had woven a digital tapestry to back him up: a rental agreement, a polished online presence, plates and ID that would hold under any scrutiny. As he adjusted his tie one final time, Marcus's thoughts drifted to his father, a grizzled Chicago cop who'd worn the badge for 30 years. The old man's voice echoed in his mind, rough but resolute. "A badge means you protect everyone, not just the ones who look like you. Good cops stop the bad ones, Marcus. It's that simple." That creed had guided his father's life, and now it fueled Marcus's resolve. His phone buzzed sharply against the sink, snapping him back to the present. A text from Sarah glowed on the screen. "Team in position. Green light when ready." He exhaled slowly, feeling the weight of the moment settle over him like a second skin. 3 surveillance units lingered at a safe distance, poised to intervene if the situation spiraled out of control. But they couldn't hover too close. Barrett and Reynolds were skittish, attuned to anything that might disrupt their game. For the most part, Marcus was a lone figure in this dance, armed only with his wits and the tools concealed in plain sight. He snatched his keys from the counter, his mind racing through every possible scenario as he strode toward the door. Stay calm. Record everything. Hold the mask, no matter what. A single slip could unravel the operation, or worse. Let these predators continue their reign of terror unchecked. Outside, the late morning sun glinted off the hood of his used Honda Civic, a car chosen with precision. Nice enough to belong in a wealthy neighborhood, but humble enough to avoid drawing eyes. As he slid into the driver's seat, the responsibility pressed against his ribs, a tangible force. This wasn't just another job. It was a reckoning, a chance to peel back the layers of corruption that had festered in Millbrook for too long, a chance to deliver justice where it had been denied. "Time to get to work," he muttered, the engine humming to life beneath his hands. In the rearview mirror, the tiny camera blinked once, a silent promise that every moment would be captured. All he had to do now was drivy and wait for Barrett and Reynolds to take the bait. 3 days into the operation, Marcus found himself gliding through Oak Hill, Millbrook's crown jewel of affluence. The streets were a gallery of opulent, sprawling homes with ivy-draped facades, lawns trimmed to perfection, flower beds bursting with color under the afternoon sun. It was just past 2 p.m., the hour when Barrett and Reynolds typically began their patrol, their cruiser a dark specter against the neighborhood's pristine backdrop. Marcus kept his speed locked at precisely 25 miles per hour. His hands steady at 10 and 2 on the wheel, his posture a textbook portrait of caution. There was nothing, absolutely nothing any officer could point to as a violation. Yet as the flicker of red and blue lights flared in his mirror, a grim certainty settled over him. "Here we go," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the thrum of his pulse. He eased the car to the curb, angling it just so, ensuring the cameras had an unobstructed view of the confrontation to come. Two figures emerged from the patrol car, their silhouettes cutting through the golden light. Barrett approached the driver's side, his towering frame casting a shadow over the window. He was a wall of a man, broad-shouldered and thick-necked, his military buzzcut and mirrored sunglasses lending him an air of cold authority. Reynolds flanked the passenger side, shorter but no less menacing, his stance radiating the same coiled aggression. Marcus knew them from the filed tire faces, their habits, the trail of ruined lives they'd left behind. He kept his hands visible on the wheel, his expression a careful mask of neutrality. Even as adrenaline surged through his veins, every second now was a thread in the tapestry of evidence he was weaving. "License and registration," Barrett barked, his voice a jagged edge, skipping any pretense of courtesy or explanation. "Of course, officer," Marcus replied, his tone smooth and deferential. "May I reach for my wallet? It's in my back pocket." Barrett gave a curt nod, his eyes hidden behind those reflective lenses, tracking Marcus's every move. As Marcus retrieved his documents with deliberate care, he caught Reynolds sweeping a flashlight across the passenger window, pointless in the bright daylight, but a clear signal of intent. "Do you know why I pulled you over?" Barrett asked, his fingers curling around the license as he studied it with exaggerated scrutiny. "No, sir, I don't," Marcus said, the truth ringing clear in his words. "Was I speeding?" Barrett's lips pressed into a thin line, a flicker of irritation crossing his face. "You're driving suspiciously slow. This is a residential area. People don't like strangers creeping around their homes." Marcus held his gaze steady, his voice unwavering despite the absurdity of the accusation. "I was driving exactly at the speed limit, sir. I'm new to the area and just being careful." From the passenger side, Reynolds's voice slithered into the exchange, sharp and accusatory. "What brings you to this neighborhood?" The implication hung heavy. "Didn't belong here. Not among these manicured estates." "I'm meeting a client," Marcus said, leaning into his cover with ease. "I do IT consulting work." Barrett cut him off, his hand drifting to rest on the holster at his hip. "Step out of the vehicle." Marcus hesitated just long enough to let the moment breathe, then asked, "May I ask why, officer?" Barrett's response was a snarl, pure and unfiltered. "Because I said so." "Turn off the car." Marcus complied, his movements slow and deliberate, every gesture choreographed for the cameras. As he stepped onto the pavement, he caught Barrett reaching up to his shoulder, likely switching off his body camera. Reynolds had already done the same silent admission that they knew the rules, and chose to break them anyway. The air thickened with tension, the situation unfolding exactly as Sarah had warned. Somewhere beyond the tree-lined street, the FBI team watched, their presence a distant lifeline. But Marcus couldn't rely on them yet, not until the officer's corruption was laid bare. "Spread your legs, hands on the hood," Barrett ordered, launching into a pat-down that was less a search and more a display of dominance, his hands rough and invasive. Reynolds circled the car, peering through the windows with predatory focus. "You said you're meeting a client," he called out. "What's their name? What's their address?" "Thomas Davidson," Marcus replied, the name of the FBI agent posing as his client rolling off his tongue. "He lives at 1240 to Oak Hill Drive." Reynolds snorted, skepticism dripping from his tone. Never heard of him. There was no reason he should have. But the dismissal was another brick in their wall of intimidation. Barrett finished the pat-down, finding nothing because there was nothing to find. Yet instead of stepping back, he leaned closer, a cold smile twisting his lips. "I smell marijuana coming from your vehicle." Inside, Marcus felt a flare of outrage, a righteous fury at the lie, but his face remained a blank slate. This was the momentary pivot where power became abuse, where justice was twisted into a weapon, and every second of it was being recorded. a testament to the consequences that awaited those who wielded their authority like a club. In that instant, Marcus understood the depth of his father's lessons. Good cops didn't just uphold the law, they rooted out the rot within their ranks. Barrett and Reynolds had no idea they'd targeted the wrong man this time. A man armed not with defiance, but with evidence. Their boldness, their arrogance, would be their undoing. And as the confrontation stretched on, Marcus stood firm, a quiet sentinel of justice, knowing that the reckoning was closer than they could ever imagine. The sun hung low in the sky, casting long, unforgiving shadows across the quiet suburban street. Marcus stood by his car, his pulse steady, but his mind buzzing with a strange mix of dread and exhilaration. He'd been through moments like this before, but today was different a day. He wasn't just a bystander or a victim. He was the bait, the trap, the silent witness to a reckoning that had been a long time coming. His hands rested lightly on the hood of his sedan, the metal warm from the afternoon heat. As he waited for the officers to make their move, he knew their playbook by heart, the rehearsed lines, the subtle intimidation, the calculated abuse of power, and he was ready. Anticipation. Officer Barrett barked, his voice dripping with mockery as he leaned in close, his breath sour with coffee and stale cigarettes. That's what we feel every time we catch someone like you. No marijuana in your car. No drugs at all, you say, his lips curled into a sneer, his eyes glinting with the kind of certainty that came from years of getting away with the same dirty trick. We'll see about that. Marcus kept his expression neutral, though inside, his chest tightened not out of fear, but from the sheer weight of what was about to unfold. I don't use drugs, officer, he said, his voice calm and deliberate, each word a lifeline to the role he had to play. He glanced at Barrett's partner, Officer Reynolds, who was already circling the car like a vulture, his hands itching to begin the search. Barrett gave a sharp nod, and Reynolds dove, his movements methodical yet theatrical, as if he were performing for an audience that wasn't there. But Marcus knew better. The real audience was hidden in the tiny camera tucked into his tie clip, its lens drinking in every detail, every misstep, every lie. As Reynolds rummaged through the car, Marcus caught a flicker of movement, a quick, sly motion as the officer slipped something from his pocket. It was a small plastic bag, its contents unmistakable even from a distance. Marcus's stomach churned, not from surprise but from the raw, bitter taste of injustice. This was the evidence planting they'd been waiting for, the smoking gun they needed to bury these corrupt cops once and for all. He forced himself to stay still, to keep his breathing even, to let them dig their own graves while the camera rolled. Every second felt like an eternity, the tension coiling tighter inside him, but he held firm. He had to. This wasn't just about him, it was about every person these officers had ever wronged, every life they'd shattered with their arrogance. Barrett's rough hand shoved Marcus harder against the hood, the metal creaking under the pressure. Don't get comfortable, the officer growled, his grip tight on Marcus's shoulder, a reminder of who held the power, so he thought. Marcus bit back the urge to push back, to call out the farce right then and there. Instead, he let his body slump slightly, playing the part of the helpless suspect, while his mind cataloged every detail. The angle of Barrett's shadow stretching across the pavement, the faint hum of a lawnmower in the distance, the way Reynolds's boots scuffed the asphalt as he pretended to search the front seats. The hidden camera whirred silently, its tiny eye perfectly positioned to capture the unfolding scene. Stand up straight, Barrett ordered, yanking Marcus away from the car with a roughness that felt more like a performance than necessity. Watch while my partner does his job. No sudden moves, you hear me? The sun beat down relentlessly, beads of sweat trickling down Marcus's neck as he stood there, exposed and vulnerable, or so it seemed. Across the street, a couple walked their dog, their steps quickening as they crossed to the other side, heads bowed to avoid the spectacle. Marcus wondered how many times they'd seen this before, how many neighbors had witnessed these officers strut through their quiet streets like kings, terrorizing anyone who didn't fit their narrow idea of who belonged. Through the car window, Marcus could see Reynolds's hands moving with exaggerated care, the plastic bag still clutched in his palm, waiting for the perfect moment to discover it. Marcus's heart thudded, not from panic but from a fierce, quiet resolve. This was the proof they'd been chasing for months. The kind of footage that would make a jury gasp and a judge's gavel fall like thunder. "What's your real reason for being here?" Barrett demanded, stepping so close that Marcus could see the faint stubble on his jaw, the veins pulsing in his neck. "And don't give me that client story again. I'm not buying it." "Sir, I've told you the truth," Marcus replied, his voice steady despite the heat and the pressure. "I'm an IT consultant. I was meeting a client, Thomas Davidson. You can call him if you don't believe me." He held Barrett's gaze, daring him to push harder, knowing every word was being recorded, every inflection preserved for the courtroom. "Shut up," Barrett snapped, his face twisting with contempt. "You know how many of you people we catch scoping out these houses? Rich neighborhood like this, and a guy like you just happens to be driving slow, looking around?" The racism hung heavy in the air, unspoken but undeniable, and Marcus felt it like a punch to the gut. He thought of the couple with the dog, the curtains twitching in nearby windows, the silent complicity of a community too afraid or too indifferent to intervene. How many times had Barrett and Reynolds done this? How many innocent people had buckled under their threats, too broken or powerless to fight back? "Hey, Barrett, come take a look at this," Reynolds called out, his voice laced with a glee so fake it was almost comical. Marcus watched through the glass as Reynolds bent down, pretending to reach under the passenger's seat, his movements slow and deliberate. Barrett's grin widened, a predator sensing blood. "Don't move," he warned Marcus, then swaggered over to join his partner. The next 30 seconds unfolded like a script the FBI had drilled into Marcus's head. Reynolds made a grand show of pulling the bag from under the seat, the same bag he'd been holding all along while Barrett stood by, arms crossed, radiating smug satisfaction. Their backs were to Marcus, but the camera in his watch caught every angle, every damning detail. Barrett strutted back, holding the bag aloft like a trophy. Well, he said, his voice booming for effect. "What do we have here?" The plastic gleamed in the sunlight, a tiny, twisted symbol of their corruption. "That's not mine," Marcus said firmly, locking eyes with Barrett. "You know it's not mine." "Really?" Barrett dangled the bag in front of him, his tone mocking. "So this baggie of cocaine just magically appeared under your seat? You expect us to believe that?" He laughed, a harsh, grating sound that echoed down the empty street. Marcus felt his jaw clench, his teeth grinding together as a wave of anger surged through him. Even knowing this was all on tape, even knowing he was an FBI agent with a team waiting in the wings, the sheer audacity of their lie burned in his chest. "Officer," he said, his voice low and controlled, "I saw your partner plant that evidence. We both know what's happening here." Reynolds let out a sharp, incredulous laugh, stepping closer. "Are you accusing officers of the law of planting evidence? That's a serious charge, boy." The word dripped with venom, a jab meant to degrade, to remind Marcus of his place here, what they thought his place should be. "Turn around," Barrett ordered, pulling out his handcuffs with a flourish. "You're under arrest for possession of cocaine with intent to distribute." The cold metal snapped around Marcus's wrists, biting into his skin as Barrett tightened them just a little too much. Inside, Marcus's mind raced not with fear, but with purpose. His team was close, watching from an unmarked van a block away, their fingers itching to storm in and end this charade. But they couldn't, not yet. They needed the full story, from the illegal stop to the falsified arrest, captured in vivid, undeniable detail. "You have the right to remain silent," Barrett began, reciting the Miranda rights with a bored monotone, his hands still gripping the cuffs. "Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." Marcus tuned him out, focusing instead on the scene around him, the exact time for 37 p.m. etched into his memory. The sun dipping lower in the sky, casting Barrett's shadow in sharp relief. The way Reynolds scribbled furiously in his notebook, no doubt weaving a web of lies to match their story. A police transport van rumbled up, its tires crunching against the curb. Marcus's eyes narrowed. They'd called it in before even finding the drugs. Another nail in their coffin, another piece of premeditation for the prosecutors to dissect. As they shoved him toward the van, he caught glimpses of neighbors peeking through their blinds, their faces pale and fleeting before the curtains snapped shut. How many, he wondered silently, how many lives had these officers upended? How many families had they torn apart with their fabricated charges and unchecked power? Barrett gave him a rough push into the van, the doors slamming shut with a hollow clang. "Enjoy prison," the officer smirked, his eyes gleaming with triumph. "Next time, think twice about driving through our neighborhood." Marcus settled onto the hard bench inside, the air thick with the scent of rust and despair. As the van pulled away, he allowed himself a faint, fleeting smile. The cameras had caught it all. The stop without cause, the body cameras conveniently switched off, the planted evidence, the casual racism dripping from their words. It was a jackpot of corruption, a gift-wrapped case for the courtroom. But for now, he had to stay in character, had to let them believe they'd won. Justice, he reminded himself, was a dish best served cold, in a packed courtroom where their lies would finally unravel. The booking process at Milburn County Jail was a slow, deliberate grind, designed to strip away dignity one humiliating step at a time. Marcus sat on a cold metal bench, his wrists still bound, the cuffs cutting into his skin as he watched the other arrestees shuffle through the system. The fluorescent lights overhead buzzed like angry insects, their harsh glare reflecting off the scuffed concrete floor. The air smelled of bleach, but it couldn't mask the deeper stench of sweat and hopelessness that clung to the walls. "Williams, Marcus," a bored corrections officer called out, his voice flat and mechanical. Marcus rose, his shoes echoing hollowly as he approached the high counter. Behind it sat Officer Peterson, a heavy-set man with a perpetual scowl, his fingers tapping lazily at a keyboard. "Empty your pockets," Peterson ordered without looking up. "Everything goes in the tray." Marcus complied, carefully sliding his wallet, keys, and phone into the metal dish. As he pressed a hidden sequence of buttons on the phone, locking it and activating its secure mode, a flicker of relief washed over him. No one would access the backups of his recordings now, not Barrett, not Reynolds, not even the techs at the jail. "Occupation," Peterson grunted, still typing. "Consultant," Marcus replied evenly. "Previous arrests?" "None." Peterson glanced up, a smirk tugging at his lips. "First time getting caught, you mean?" "Barrett and Reynolds don't mess around. If they found drugs in your car, they were yours." His tone was smug, as if he'd seen this play out 100 times and never once questioned the script. Marcus said nothing, his gaze drifting to the corner of the room where Barrett and Reynolds lingered, hunched over their arrest reports. They were meticulous, their heads bent close as they murmured to each other, aligning their stories with the precision of seasoned liars. Nearby, another officer approached with a camera. "Raise your right hand," he barked. The flash blinded Marcus for a moment, forcing him to blink as he turned left, then right, then faced forward. The routine as mechanical as it was dehumanizing. Fingerprinting came next, the ink smudging across his fingers as they pressed them into the pad. Marcus thought of how these same prints were stored in the FBI database under his real name, a secret buried behind layers of clearance only a handful of people could breach. "Drug test time," Peterson announced, nodding to an officer named Jenkins, a weary man with a permanent sneer. What followed was a blur of indignities, changing into an orange jumpsuit that smelled faintly of mildew, enduring a pat-down that felt more like a power trip than a search, providing samples under Jenkins's watchful eye, answering a litany of questions about his medical history. Through it all, Marcus played his part, confused, frustrated, but never defiant enough to draw extra attention. Finally, they led him to a holding cell, its metal bunks welded to the walls like rusted relics. 3 other men sat inside, their eyes dull and distant, barely acknowledging his arrival. "Phone call in 10 minutes," a guard shouted down the hall. Marcus sank onto an empty bunk, his mind racing. The call was his lifeline, a chance to signal his team without tipping off the officers watching his every move. When his name was called, he walked to the phone area, each step measured, each breath deliberate. The phones were separated by flimsy dividers, offering a pretense of privacy. But Marcus knew every word was recorded. He dialed the number a burner listed as his sister's and waited. "Hello," a woman's voice answered. Sharp but familiar, it was Agent Chen, her tone masked by a voice modifier. "Hey, Lisa," Marcus said, letting his voice sag with exhaustion and worry. "It's me. I'm in jail." "What happened?" Chen asked, sticking to their rehearsed script. These cops said they found drugs in my car, but they planted them. You have to believe May wouldn't. Calm down, Chen cut in. Are you hurt? No, I'm okay. The phrase was their code, a green light that the operation had succeeded. They're saying it's cocaine, he continued, his voice trembling just enough to sell the act. They're trying to pin serious time on me. Don't worry, Chen replied smoothly. I'll call Uncle Jim right away. He'll know what to do. Uncle Jim there standing for the FBI legal team. Thanks, sis. Tell Mom not to worry, okay? That was the final signal. The recordings had uploaded successfully. The call ended, and Marcus returned to his cell, the weight of the day settling into his bones. Now came the waiting, hardest part of all. He had to spend at least one night behind bars, letting the illusion hold, keeping Barrett and Reynolds smug and unsuspecting. Through the small window in the cell door, he watched the shadows shift in the hallway, the faint clatter of keys and muffled voices drifting through the walls. The other men in the cell stirred occasionally, their own stories etched into their slumped postures and hollow stares. One, a skinny kid with a bruised cheek, muttered to himself about a girlfriend who wouldn't post bail. Another, an older man with gray stubble, stared at the ceiling as if searching for answers in the cracks. Marcus leaned back against the wall, the cold metal seeping through his jumpsuit. He thought of the courtroom that awaited the packed gallery, the judge's stern gaze, the moment when the footage would play and Barrett and Reynolds' smug grins would falter. Justice wasn't just about punishment, he reminded himself. It was about exposing the rot, about showing the world what happened when power went unchecked. And as the hours ticked by in that dim, stifling cell, Marcus held onto that truth, letting it anchor him through the long night ahead. The air in the processing room hung heavy, thick with the scent of sweat and stale coffee. As Marcus stood among the other inmates, most of them were black or Hispanic, their faces etched with a mix of exhaustion, defiance, and quiet despair. He couldn't help but wonder how many of these men were truly guilty of the crimes pinned on them, and how many had been swallowed whole by the same rotting, corrupt system he'd dedicated himself to dismantling. His eyes scanned the room, taking in the flickering fluorescent lights overhead and the chipped paint peeling from the concrete walls, a grim reflection of the lives trapped within them. Each man's story seemed to linger unspoken in the air, dreams derailed, families fractured, futures stolen. Marcus clenched his fists, the weight of his mission pressing against his chest like a stone. An older black man, his hair graying at the temples and his shoulders stooped from years of carrying burdens, too heavy to name, shuffled closer to Marcus. He noticed the flicker of resolve in Marcus's eyes, the way his jaw tightened as he surveyed the room. First time inside, the man asked, his voice low and raspy, as though it had been worn down by decades of whispered truths. Marcus gave a slight nod, his throat too tight to speak. The older man leaned in, his breath warm against the cold dampness of the cell block. Word of advice, son, he murmured, his tone carrying the weight of hard-earned wisdom. Whatever they say you did, just take the plea deal, fighting it. That'll only dig your grave deeper. That's how it works around here, always has. His eyes, clouded with resignation, met Marcus's for a moment before he turned away, retreating into the shadows of the cell like a ghost fading into the night. But Marcus's mind churned with a fire the old man couldn't see. Not this time, he thought, his resolve hardening like steel in a forge. This time, things are going to unravel differently. This time, I'm the spark that burns it all down. As he lay on the thin, lumpy mattress of his jail cot that first night, the distant clang of metal doors and the muffled shouts of guards echoing through the halls, he felt a strange calm settle over him. He wasn't just another inmate. He was a weapon, carefully concealed, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Meanwhile, miles away in a dimly lit operations room, FBI Special Agent Sarah Chen sat hunched over a cluttered desk, her sharp eyes glued to a flickering monitor. The glow of the screen cast harsh shadows across her face, illuminating the lines of exhaustion etched there from sleepless nights and relentless determination. She replayed the footage from Marcus's hidden cameras again and again, her fingers tapping restlessly against the desk. The images were unmistakable. Fikers Barrett and Reynolds, their smug grins barely concealed. planting evidence in Marcus's car with practiced ease. Their voices crackled through the audio, dripping with casual racism and arrogance, as if they believed the world would always bend to their will. Sarah's stomach twisted with disgust, but her mind raced with purpose. These two weren't enough. She didn't just want the foot soldiers. She wanted the whole diseased system that shielded them: the captains, the prosecutors, the judges who turned a blind eye while lives crumbled. "Play that body camera deactivation again," she ordered, her voice cutting through the hum of the room. Agent Rodriguez, a weary man with quick hands and a quicker mind, nodded from his station at the computer. His fingers danced across the keyboard, pulling up the clip. There it was, Barrett's meaty hand reaching up to his chest, switching off his camera with a deliberate flick, his lips curling into a smirk as he glanced at Reynolds. The search began seconds later, a choreographed performance of corruption. Sarah's eyes narrowed, her pulse quickening. "Got something interesting over here," Agent Thompson called out from across the room, his voice tinged with excitement. He was a lanky figure, his tie perpetually loosened, his desk buried under stacks of files and empty coffee cups. Sarah crossed the room in quick strides, her boots clicking against the linoleum floor, and leaned over his shoulder. Thompson's screen displayed a map of Millbrook, dotted with dozens of red pins like bloodstains on a canvas, each marked an arrest made by Barrett and Reynolds over the past 6 months. "Notice anything?" he asked, zooming in with a flourish. Sarah's breath caught as the pattern emerged: every single arrest, clustered in the city's wealthiest neighborhoods, streets lined with manicured lawns and gleaming SUVs. "And here's the kicker," Thompson added, clicking through a series of arrest records with a triumphant grin. 87% of their targets were Black or Hispanic. But wait for it, over half those cases got tossed out in court because the evidence was so obviously planted. Sarah finished his thought, her voice low and steely. But the damage was already done. Jobs lost, homes foreclosed, reputations shredded, all while these two strutted around like kings. The room fell silent, the weight of their discovery settling over them like a fog. This wasn't just about a pair of rogue cops. It was about a machine that chewed up lives and spat them out, fueled by prejudice and unchecked power. Suddenly, Agent Wilson burst through the door, her arms laden with a chaotic stack of papers. She was a petite woman with a fierce energy, her glasses perpetually sliding down her nose as she juggled her endless tasks. "You need to see this," she said breathlessly, spreading the documents across the table like a dealer laying out cards. "I've been digging through interviews with former officers. 3 of them flagged Barrett, and Reynolds specifically. Said they tried reporting them for misconduct years ago, but every complaint vanished into thin air." Sarah's eyes flicked to Wilson, her mind already racing. "Who handled those complaints?" she asked, her tone sharp. Wilson's lips quirked into a grim smile. "That's the juicy part. Every single misconduct report went through Captain Thomas Green. And get this, Green and Barrett go way back. Same high school, same football team. Their dads even pounded the beat together back in the day." Sarah began pacing, her boots thudding against the floor as the pieces clicked into place. "So Green buried the complaints to protect his buddy," she muttered, her thoughts spinning. "What else did these ex-officers say?" Wilson straightened, her voice steady despite the fire in her eyes. "They called it an open secret. Barrett and Reynolds would rack up arrests. Green would sweep any trouble under the rug, and the DA's office would ram through plea deals before anyone could blink. Clockwork." Just then, Sarah's secure phone buzzed, jolting her from her thoughts. It was a message from Marcus's undercover Linea Miracle. He'd managed to send it from inside the jail. She read it aloud, her voice tight with urgency. "Guards talking. Not the only ones Barrett and Reynolds brought in today. 2 more false arrests, same neighborhood. Rodriguez," she barked, spinning toward him. "Pull up today's arrest records for that precinct." His fingers flew across the keys, and within moments, the screen confirmed it. More Black men, hauled in hours after Marcus. Both nabbed during traffic stops in the same ritzy area, both with drugs found in their cars. "They're getting bolder," Thompson observed, leaning back in his chair with a low whistle. 3 in one day. They think they're untouchable. Sarah's lips pressed into a thin line. "They won't be for long." She strode to a whiteboard dominating one wall, marker in hand. and began sketching a web of connections. "Here's the playbook," she said, her voice rising with conviction. "Barrett and Reynolds make the arrests. Green covers their tracks. The DA's office pushes plea deals so fast no one can fight back. Wilson cut in, her eyes glued to her laptop. "Speaking of the DA, I just found something. Assistant DA Robert Phillips is the one handling most of these cases personally. Check his conviction rate near perfect. Everyone takes the plea because they're terrified, broke, or both. No money for lawyers. No stomach for a trial." Sarah nodded, her marker squeaking as she added Phillips's name to the board. "It's a machine," she said, stepping back to survey the sprawling diagram. "Racism and corruption. Oiled and running smooth, from the streets to the courtroom." Her phone buzzed again. A contact at the jail. "Arraignment set for tomorrow morning," she announced, Judge Sandra Martinez presiding. Rodriguez groaned, running a hand through his dark hair. "Martinez, she's a brick walto on drug crimes, always backs the cops." But Sarah's face broke into a rare smile, a glint of triumph in her eyes. "Perfect. The tougher she is, the louder this crash will be. Everyone in that courtroom tomorrow expects to see another black man railroaded. Instead, they'll watch their whole rotten empire collapse." She turned to her team, her voice ringing with command. "Get everything prepped. Tomorrow, we end this." By 9 a.m., the Millbrook County Courthouse buzzed with restless energy. Marcus sat in the defendant's chair, his orange jumpsuit stiff and scratchy against his skin, his wrists chafed by the cold bite of handcuffs. Across the room, Barrett and Reynolds lounged near the prosecutor's table, their postures oozing confidence. Barrett adjusted his uniform collar with a lazy smirk, while Reynolds shot Marcus a mocking glance, his eyes glinting with the certainty of victory. They'd played this game hundreds of times. Another day, another life crushed beneath their boots. The room hushed as Judge Sandra Martinez swept in, her black robes billowing like a storm cloud, her stern face carved from years of upholding a justice she believed unassailable. "All rise," the bailiff bellowed, and the crowd obeyed, a ripple of tension spreading through the air. Marcus kept his head bowed, his expression a mask of defeat, but his peripheral vision caught movement at the back of the room. Unfamiliar Facesvi agents in plain clothes slipped in quietly, their presence unnoticed by the smug officers or the polished assistant DA, Robert Phillips, who stood adjusting his silk tie with manicured hands. "Case number 20-5 CR 1484. The clerk intoned, "State versus Marcus Williams. Charges, possession of cocaine with intent to distribute." Phillips stepped forward, his voice smooth as velvet. "Your Honor, the state has compelling evidence. The defendant was apprehended with a significant quantity of cocaine during a routine traffic stop." Martinez peered down at Marcus, her gaze icy and unyielding, a look she'd leveled at countless others like him. Before Marcus's court-appointed lawyer, a jittery man with a rumpled suit and a nervous stammercold respond, the courtroom doors swung open with a bang. Sarah Chen strode in, her FBI jacket crisp, her team fanning out behind her in tactical gear. "Your Honor," she called, her voice slicing through the murmurs. "The FBI requests to intervene." Barrett's smirk faltered. Reynolds shifted toward the exit, only to find it blocked by stone-faced agents. Martinez's brow furrowed, irritation flashing across her face. "And who are you?" she snapped. "FBI Director Sarah Chen," Sarah replied, planting herself at the room's center. "And the defendant is FBI Special Agent Marcus Thompson, working undercover to expose systemic corruption in the Millbrook Police Department." The courtroom exploded in gasps and whispers. Phillips's polished facade cracked, his mouth opening in protest. "This is absurd. Your Honor, Agent Thompson," Sarah pressed on undeterred, "was outfitted with hidden cameras during his arrest. We have undeniable footage of officers Barrett and Reynolds planting cocaine in his vehicle. After an illegal stop." Martinez's composure wavered, a flicker of doubt in her eyes. "These are grave accusations, Director Chen." "They are," Sarah agreed, nodding to an agent who wheeled in a screen. "With the court's permission, we'd like to show the evidence." Martinez hesitated, then gave a curt nod. The lights dimmed, and the video rolled. The room fell silent, Every eye locked on the screen as Barrett and Reynolds executed their scheme, stopping Marcus's car without cause, disabling their cameras with practiced flicks, slipping drugs into his glove box with chilling nonchalance. "Stop the video," Barrett shouted, his voice ragged with panic. "This is a setup, officers, be silent," Martinez barked, her face paling as the truth unfolded before her. Sarah stepped forward. "Your Honor, we've documented over 100 similar cases, 3 years of Barrett and Reynolds targeting Black and Hispanic drivers in wealthy areas, planting evidence, forcing plea deals. It's a pattern of abuse, protected by Captain Green and enabled by Assistant DA Phillips." Marcus rose, his voice steady despite the tremor in his hands. "Your Honor, we move for immediate dismissal of all charges," Chen added. "The FBI is also charging Barrett and Reynolds with federal crimes, including civil rights violations." The room spun into Caus Phillips' spluttering objections. Barrett and Reynolds shrinking under the weight of their unraveling lies. Martinez's gavel slammed down, but her eyes betrayed a dawning horror. Justice, she'd always believed, was blind. Now, she saw how it had been twisted to crush the very people it should protect. For Marcus, Sarah, and the team, this wasn't just a victory over to corrupt cops. It was a searing lesson in justice, how power, unchecked, festers into tyranny, and how the consequences of that abuse ripple through lives, families, communities. Barrett and Reynolds had thought themselves invincible, but the system they'd gamed had a fatal flaw. It underestimated the courage of those willing to fight back. Tomorrow, the headlines would scream, the investigations would widen, and the people of Millbrook would demand answers. For now, though, Marcus stood tall, the cuffs falling away, his eyes locked on the future where the scales might finally tip toward truth. The courtroom buzzed with tension, a storm brewing beneath the polished wood and stern faces. Assistant District Attorney Phillips shuffled his papers with trembling hands, his mind racing as he tried to cling to the illusion of control. "Your Honor," he began, his voice wavering slightly, "the state requires additional time to review these developments." But before he could finish, Judge Martinez cut him off with a sharp, commanding tone that echoed through the room. "Sit down, Mr. Phillips. You're not going anywhere." Her dark eyes flashed with a mix of fury and resolve as she turned to the FBI agents, standing poised at the edges of the chamber. "Take the officers into custody," she ordered, her words slicing through the air like a blade. As the agents moved toward Officers Barrett and Reynolds, the room erupted into chaos. Barrett's broad shoulders stiffened, his jaw tightening as he shot a venomous glare at the approaching figures, while Reynolds, weary and pale, shrank back, his eyes darting toward the exit as if calculating an impossible escape. Handcuffs clinked ominously as the agents closed in, their movements swift and unyielding. From the back of the courtroom, Captain Green, a hulking man with a weathered face, watched the scene unfold with a growing sense of dread. His meaty hands fidgeted with the brim of his cap before he made a subtle move toward the door, his polished boots scuffing the floor in his haste. But the FBI was faster. Trois agents intercepted him, their firm grips on his arms pulling him back into the fray. His face flushed red, a mix of anger and shame, as he realized there was no slipping away from the consequences this time. Phillips slumped into his chair, frozen, his once pristine reputation unraveling before his eyes. His perfect conviction record cornerstone of his career crumbled like a house of cards. In a gust of wind, sweat beaded on his forehead as he stared blankly at the table, the weight of his complicity pressing down on him. Across the room, Marcus, a tall figure with steady hands and a quiet strength, unlocked his handcuffs with a key handed to him by an agent. The metal clattered to the floor, a small but triumphant sound in the midst of the uproar. He stood tall, his gaze locking onto Barrett and Reynolds as they were led away, their wrists now bound in the same chains they had used to shackle countless innocents. There was no gloating in his expression, only a deep, unshakable determination, tempered by the knowledge of the lives they had shattered. "Court is adjourned," Judge Martinez declared, her voice trembling just enough to betray the storm of emotions raging within her. She turned to Agent Thompson, her expression softening slightly. "I believe we have a lot of cases to review." The gavel struck the bench with a resounding crack. and the room began to empty, but the echoes of that moment lingered, heavy with the promise of justice long delayed. Within hours, the story burst onto the national stage like wildfire racing through dry grass. Outside the Millbrook County Courthouse, camera crews swarmed the steps, their lenses glinting in the late afternoon sun as they captured every movement. Marcus emerged, now wearing his FBI badge proudly pinned to his chest, a symbol of the truth he had fought to uncover. Beside him stood Director Chen, a stern woman with sharp features and an air of quiet authority, her presence a silent testament to the weight of the investigation. Behind them, Barrett and Reynolds shuffled toward FBI vehicles, their heads bowed low to avoid the relentless flashes of the cameras. The once proud officers, who had strutted through Millbrook with unchecked power, now looked small, diminished, their arrogance stripped away by the cold steel around their wrists. "Agent Thompson," reporters shouted, their voices overlapping in a frantic chorus. "How long did this investigation take? Were you ever afraid for your safety? How many innocent people were wrongfully arrested?" Marcus stepped up to the cluster of microphones, his broad shoulders squared, his voice steady as a rock despite the exhaustion tugging at his bones. "Today isn't about me," he said, his words cutting through the noise with quiet power. "It's about the hundreds of innocent people whose lives were torn apart by corrupt officers who abused their authority. It's about a system that turned a blind eye for far too long." His eyes, dark and resolute, scanned the crowd, carrying the weight of every story he had uncovered, every tearful confession he had heard. Inside the courthouse, the aftermath was a whirlwind of activity. Phones rang incessantly, their shrill tones blending into a chaotic symphony. As the court clerk's office struggled to keep up, people who had been ensnared by Barrett and Reynolds over the years, men and women whose lives had been upended by false charges, flooded the lines, their voices trembling with hope and anger as they demanded their stories be heard. "We've set up a special hotline," Director Chen announced to the press, her tone clipped but firm. "Anyone who believes they were falsely arrested by these officers should call. Every case will be reviewed, every single one." Her words were a promise, a lifeline thrown to those who had been drowning in despair. The story dominated television screens nationwide. News channels flashed split-screen footage on one side. Marcus's grainy hidden camera recordings exposed the officers' blatant corruption, Barrett's gruff voice barking lies, Reynolds planting evidence with practiced ease on the other. Clips of their past arrests played in stark contrast. A parade of innocent faces marched off in handcuffs. A civil rights lawyer on CNN leaned into the camera, her voice sharp with conviction. "This isn't just about two rogue cops," she said. "This is systematic racism, shielded by those in power." The police captain buried complaints. The DA's office strong-armed unfair plea deals. Judges signed off without a second thought. Her words struck a nerve, igniting a firestorm of outrage that swept across social media. Hashtags like Agent Thompson and Justicine Millbrook surged to the top of trending lists. As people shared their own encounters with police harassment, their posts a mosaic of pain and defiance. At FBI headquarters, Marcus sat in a dimly lit conference room, the flickering glow of the TV casting shadows across his face. His phone buzzed relentlessly with messages from fellow agents, congratulations, praise, words of but he barely noticed. His thoughts were with the victims, their faces etched into his memory from the files he had pored over night after night. Director Chen strode in, a tablet cradled in her arm, her expression a mix of triumph and urgency. "First case just got overturned," she said, tapping the screen. "Michael Carterth, college student they nabbed last year. You remember him?" Marcus nodded, the details flooding back. A bright young man visiting his grandmother, arrested on fabricated charges, forced to drop out of school after a coerced plea deal. Judge Martinez vacated his conviction. Chen continued, "He's being released tonight, and that's just the start." The investigation snowballed with breathtaking speed. FBI agents descended on Millbrook, combing through every case Barrett and Reynolds had touched. They interviewed tight-lipped officers, scrutinized hours of body camera footage, and unearthed complaint records that had been hastily shredded but not entirely destroyed. Captain Green was hauled in for questioning, riving with a slick, expensive lawyer whose tailored suit screamed confidence. But that bravado melted away when agents slid a stack of recovered documents across the table proof. He had personally ordered the destruction of evidence. By midnight, his resignation letter sat on the police chief's desk, his career in ruins. Assistant DA Phillips fared no better. Internal analysis painted a damning picture. He had pushed for brutal sentences against minority defendants while doling out lenient plea deals to white offenders for identical crimes. A whole house of cards is collapsing, Chen told Marcus, her voice low but fierce. Phillips is cooperating, no spilling names, showing us how deep this rot goes. His betrayal stung, but it was a necessary crack in the facade, exposing the machinery of injustice that had operated unchecked for years. Outside the courthouse, the community rallied. Local leaders organized a candlelight vigil, the flickering flames casting a warm glow on hundreds of families of the wrongly convicted, their eyes glistening with tears and tentative hope. They stood shoulder to shoulder, sharing stories of dreams derailed, jobs lost to false arrests, relationships fractured by shame, futures stolen by a system that refused to see them. Marcus lingered at the back, his tall frame blending into the shadows, until an older woman approached him. Her hands trembled as she clutched a faded photograph of a young man. "My son," she whispered, her voice breaking. 2 years ago, those officers took him. He swore they planted the drugs, but no one believed him. He's still locked up." Marcus met her gaze, his own eyes softening with a quiet promise. "We'll review his case," he said. "Every case, no matter how long it takes." Later that night, Marcus collapsed onto his couch, exhaustion seeping into his bones. His small apartment was cluttered with case files, each folder a life Barrett and Reynolds had tried to erase. His phone buzzed again, a text from Chen. "Tomorrow's going to be busy. Internal Affairs is launching a full investigation. The mayor's demanding an overhaul of police procedures. 3 more judges are reviewing their rulings." A tired smile tugged at his lips. It was only the beginning, a faint glimmer of change in a town long shrouded in darkness. The truth had clawed its way out, and there was no stuffing it back into the shadows. 6 months later, Marcus stood before a packed hearing room in the United States Congress. The air was thick with anticipation, journalists scribbling furiously, civil rights leaders nodding solemnly, and families of the affected clutching one another's hands. Behind him sat rows of people whose convictions had been overturned, ordinary men and women given back their lives because of Millbrook's reckoning. "We've reviewed over 300 cases tied to Barrett and Reynolds," Marcus testified, his voice ringing with unshakable clarity. 247 convictions overturned, 180 to people released from prison. But numbers don't capture the human cost. He held up a photograph, his fingers steady. "This is Michael Carter, arrested as a college student. He's back in school now, studying law to fight for others. And this," he said, lifting another image, "is James Wilson. Lost his teaching job after they framed him. He's teaching again, and he runs a support group for victims." The courtroom where it all began had transformed to. Judge Martinez, shaken to her core by her unwitting role in the injustice, had become a fierce advocate for reform. One morning, a young prosecutor stood before her, stammering, "Your Honor, the officer's body camera malfunctioned during this arrest." She didn't let him finish. "Case dismissed," she snapped. "No exceptions, no camera, no case." Her gavel fell like a thunderclap, a sound that reverberated through a Millbrook Police Department now unrecognizable. The new chief, Patricia Robinson, a formidable black woman with a steely gaze, had swept in with sweeping changes, mandatory body cameras that couldn't be disabled, random drug tests for officers, and a civilian board to investigate every complaint. Barrett and Reynolds faced their reckoning in a trial that unfolded with brutal efficiency. Marcus's recordings, paired with testimony from fellow officers who had finally broken their silence, left no room for doubt. The judge, his voice grave as he recounted the lives they had destroyed, sentenced them to 20 years in federal prison. "How does it feel?" a reporter shouted as they were led away. "To end up in the same prisons you sent innocent people to," neither man answered, their silence a final admission of defeat. Captain Green had already pleaded guilty to lesser charges, trading his testimony to expose other corrupt officials. Phillips, disbarred and awaiting trial, watched his career dissolve into ash. The ripples spread far beyond Millbrook. Police departments nationwide scrutinized their own practices. Lawmakers drafted bills mandating independent investigations of misconduct, and civil rights groups seized the case as a rallying cry for reform. Marcus's mailbox overflowed with letter stories of harassment. Gratitude for his courage, but one stood out, a note from his father, a retired Chicago cop. "Son," it read, "what you did in Millbrook isn't just about catching bad cops. It's about protecting what the bad should mean." Marcus traced the words with his finger, the lesson sinking deep. Justice wasn't just punishment, it was restoration, accountability, a reckoning for those who dared to wield power without mercy. The autumn sun dipped low over Pine Grove, painting the sky in hues of amber and crimson as it sank behind the orderly rows of colonial-style homes. Long shadows stretched across the manicured lawns and quiet streets of the affluent suburb, where the air carried the faint scent of fallen leaves and chimney smoke. Marcus Johnson, a tall, lean 17-year-old with the weary strength of an athlete, shifted the weight of his basketball duffel bag on his shoulder as he made his way home. From practice, his muscles ached from the grueling drills, but a quiet pride warmed his chest. Just hours earlier, Coach had pulled him aside, clapping a hand on his back and announcing him as team captain for the upcoming season. The thought of that letter C soon to be stitched onto his varsity jacket made his steps lighter. Despite the fatigue tugging at his limbs, he could already picture his mother's beaming smile when he told her, and his father's understated grin, one that always said, "Hard work pays off, son." Without needing words, it had been just 3 weeks since Marcus and his family moved to this predominantly white neighborhood, a change spurred by his father's promotion to police chief, city's first black man to hold the title. The move had brought a bigger house, better schools, and a fresh start. Though Marcus still felt the pang of leaving his old friends behind, he understood what it meant. Thought his father's rise was a victory not just for their family, but for everyone who'd been told the system couldn't bend. The evening air turned crisp, and Marcus tugged his jacket tighter around him, the fabric rustling softly as he turned onto Maple Street. 2 blocks from home, the streetlights blinked on one by one, casting pools of golden light across the pavement, and the houses stood like silent sentinels, their windows glowing faintly with the lives unfolding inside. Behind him, the low rumble of an engine broke the stillness. Marcus glanced over his shoulder and saw a police cruiser easing down the street, its headlights slicing through the dusk and stretching his shadow long and thin ahead of him. His pulse quickened, a faint thudding in his ears, but he kept his pace steady, his father's voice echoing in his mind, "Stay calm, be respectful, know your rights." He'd heard those words countless times, drilled into him with the weight of a man who'd lived them first as a black teenager, then as a cop climbing the ranks. Marcus adjusted his grip on his duffel bag, the basketball inside shifting with a muffled thump, and kept walking, willing himself to believe this was nothing. After all, this was his neighborhood now. He belonged here. Inside the cruiser, Officer James Barrett, a grizzled 15-year veteran with a buzzed haircut and a perpetually hard-set jaw, narrowed his eyes as he studied Marcus through the windshield. "That kid doesn't look like he fits around here," he muttered, his voice gravelly with suspicion. Beside him, Officer Thomas Reynolds, younger and still green enough to follow Barrett's lead without question, nodded absently, his fingers already tapping at the laptop mounted between them. "Checking for any break-ins in the area," he said, his tone clipped as the screen flickered to life. Barrett grunted, his gaze never leaving Marcus. The boy's athletic frame, the duffel bag, the way he moved with quiet confidence, it didn't sit right with him, though he couldn't say why. Maybe it was the years of patrolling these streets, where anything out of place felt like a threat waiting to reveal itself. Marcus heard the tires crunching slowly over the asphalt behind him, a sound that seemed to amplify in the stillness. His stomach tightened, but he forced his breathing to stay even. He hadn't done anything wrong, was just a kid heading home after practice. Still, the creeping unease gnawed at him. a feeling he couldn't shake as the cruiser shadowed his every step. His hand slipped into his pocket, fingers brushing the cool edge of his phone. His father had programmed his direct line into the speed dial the day they'd unpacked their boxes. In the new house, just in case, he'd said, his dark eyes heavy with a lifetime of knowing what just in case could mean. Marcus hesitated, thumb hovering over the button, wondering if this was the moment his father had warned him about. Across the street, a couple walking their golden retriever paused, their heads turning toward the unfolding scene. The dog's leash went slack as they whispered to each other, then hurried to the opposite sidewalk, casting wary glances over their shoulders. In the nearby houses, curtains twitched, and a few faces pressed against windows, drawn by the quiet tension thickening in the air. The cruiser's lights suddenly flared to life, red and blue spinning across the pavement like a warning. Marcus froze, his hand tightening around his phone as the basketball rolled against his leg with a soft thud. His heart hammered now, loud enough that he wondered if the officers could hear it too. "Got any reports of suspicious activity?" Reynolds asked, his fingers poised over the keyboard. Barrett shook his head, already unbuckling his seatbelt. "Nothing yet, but let's check him out. These neighborhoods have been having issues lately." His words hung heavy, though he didn't mention that those issues had been petty vandalism and lost pet snothing tied to a young black man walking home. He pushed open the door and stepped out, his boots hitting the ground with a deliberate thud. Reynolds followed, his movements sharper, almost eager. Marcus stood still, his mind racing through every lesson his father had taught him. Keep your hands visible, speak clearly, don't move too fast, record everything if you can. The irony twisted in his gut. His father was these officers' boss now, the man who'd spent decades fighting for a system that could be fair. Yet here Marcus was, heart pounding under the weight of their stares, feeling like a stranger in his own skin. The evening breeze carried the sound of Barrett's footsteps, steady and unhurried, as he approached. Marcus squared his shoulders, his fingers finding the emergency dial button on his phone and pressing it silently. The call connected, transmitting his location and every word to dispatch, just as his father had shown him. "Turn around slowly," Barrett's voice cut through the quiet, sharp and commanding. "Keep your hands where we can see them." Marcus complied, his movements careful and deliberate. Turning to face the officers, the fading sunlight glinted off their badges, catching the cold glint in Barrett's eyes and the tense set of Reynolds' jaw. Marcus's throat tightened, but he met their gazes steadily, his phone a lifeline in his pocket. This wasn't just a routine stop anymore. He could feel it in the air, thick with something unspoken. "What are you doing in this neighborhood?" Barrett demanded, his hand resting on his utility belt, fingers inches from his holster. The streetlight overhead cast stark shadows across his face, deepening the lines of his scowl. Marcus swallowed, his voice calm despite the storm brewing inside him. "I live here, sir. Just heading home from basketball practice." He nodded toward his duffel bag, keeping the motion slow. "I'm the team captain." Reynolds circled behind him, his boots scraping the pavement like a predator sizing up prey. "Got any ID on you?" he asked, his tone laced with doubt, as if Marcus's words were a story too flimsy to hold. "Yes, sir," Marcus replied, his voice steady despite the sweat prickling his neck. "It's in my wallet. My father and I moved here 3 weeks ago. We live at 1542 Maple Street." Barrett's brow arched, a flicker of disbelief crossing his face. "That's the new house of the one they renovated last month," he said, his voice dripping with skepticism. "You expect us to believe you live there?" Marcus nodded, reaching for his wallet with exaggerated care, when his phone buzzed faintly in his pocket. Both officers tensed instantly, hands snapping to their weapons. "Stop!" Barrett barked, his voice slicing through the night. "What's in your pocket?" Marcus's breath caught, but he kept his tone even, his father's mantra looping in his head. "Stay calm, no matter what. It's just my phone, sir. I can show you my ID and proof of address." Reynolds stepped closer, speaking into his radio with a clipped urgency. "Dispatch. Requesting K9 unit to Maple Street. Suspicious individual, possibly armed." The static crackle of the response echoed unnaturally loud in the hushed street, and Marcus felt his stomach lurch. Armed, he was a kid with a basketball and a phone, not a threat. But the officers' faces told a different story. Barrett's hardened with suspicion, Reynolds twitching with nervous energy. More porch lights flicked on, casting a patchwork of glow across the lawns. Neighbors emerged, drawn by the flashing lights and rising voices. Mrs. Henderson, a white-haired widow who'd welcomed Marcus and his father with a homemade apple pie, shuffled onto her porch, clutching her cardigan. "Officers, that young man lives here," she called, her voice trembling but firm. "He's the new police chief's son." Reynolds waved her off without looking. "Mum, please stay back. This is a police matter." The growl of another engine approached, and Marcus's heart sank as the K9 unit's SUV rolled onto the street, its lights pulsing silently. The situation was spiraling, a runaway train he couldn't stop. He tightened his grip on his phone, praying the call was still live, that his father would hear the truth unfolding. "Officers, I understand you're doing your job," he said, his voice steady despite the chaos swelling around him. "But I'm not armed. I'm just trying to get home. My father is." "Keep your hands where we can see them," Barrett snapped, cutting him off, his patience fraying. The dog barked from the SUV, a sharp sound that made Marcus flinch. In that moment, he realized how fragile justice could be, how quickly power could twist into something ugly, even under the watch of good men like his father. 1 year later, the air in Millbrook carried a different weight. The city buzzed with quiet pride as Marcus stood on a makeshift stage. The autumn sun now setting over a new community center, Thompson Justice Center. Its brick facade gleamed under the fading light, a symbol of hope carved from the ashes of corruption. The building was more than a structure. It was a pro Macedo foster trust between police and the people they served, to offer legal aid to those the system had failed. Marcus adjusted the FBI badge pinned to his chest, its weight a reminder of the path he'd chosen after that night on Maple Street. The crowd stretched before him, a sea of faces reflecting the change he'd helped ignite. Michael Carter, once a nervous witness in the case that broke the scandal wide open, sat in the front row, his law school textbooks tucked under his arm. Beside him, James Wilson, a weary teacher with a penchant for quoting poetry, chatted with his colleagues, their laughter a soft undercurrent to the murmurs of the gathering. Families reunited after wrongful convictions stood together, their eyes bright with tears and triumph. And in the back, a group of new police recruits, black, white, Hispanic. Men and women stood tall in their crisp uniforms, body cameras glinting under the lights. Chief Robinson, Marcus's father, had overseen their training, instilling a code that put justice above ego. Marcus cleared his throat, the microphone amplifying his voice over the rustling leaves. "Someone once told me fighting the system is hopeless," he began, his tone steady but laced with the fire of memory. "They said taking the plea deal, keeping your head down, that's just how things work. But we proved them wrong." His gaze swept the crowd, lingering on the recruits. "We showed that justice isn't a dream. It's a choice. It happens when good people stand up, when they speak the truth, even when their voices shake." He touched his badge again, feeling its cool metal against his fingertips. "This means nothing if we don't use it to protect everyone and not just the ones who look like us, or live where we do, or fit some picture in our heads. Change isn't easy. It's messy, and it's slow, and we've still got miles to go. But Millbrook taught us something. When we drag corruption into the light, when we demand better not just for ourselves, but for everyone who can turn the system into something worth believing in." The crowd erupted, rising to their feet in a wave of applause that rolled over him like thunder. But Marcus didn't bask in it. His eyes were fixed on those recruits, their faces a mosaic of determination and purpose. They weren't just replacements for Barrett and Reynolds, the two officers whose abuse of power had sparked this reckoning. They were proof that the system hadn't just punished it had healed. Barrett and Reynolds had faced their reckoning, stripped of their badges and locked away. But the real victory wasn't their fall. It was this: a community remade, a force rebuilt, a lesson etched in stone that power unchecked breeds ruin, and justice, when fought for, can mend what's broken. As the ovation faded, Marcus stepped back, his chest tight with something deeper than pride, gratitude, maybe, or resolve. The sun dipped below the horizon, casting the Thompson Justice Center in twilight's glow. Mrs. Henderson stood near the edge of the crowd, her frail hands clapping softly, a quiet smile on her lips. She'd been there that night, her voice cutting through the chaos to defend him. A neighbor who'd seen past the color of his skin to the boy he was. Beside her, a young girlone of the reunited daughters clutched her father's hand, her eyes wide with the wonder of a world made right. Marcus thought of his father, standing off stage, his knowing smile as steady as ever. Chief Robinson had faced his own battles, that Yerpushback from old guard cops, sleepless nights rewriting policies. The weight of proving his son's ordeal wasn't in vain. But he'd done it, not with anger, but with the quiet strength Marcus had always admired. The lesson lingered in the air. Heavier than the applause, justice wasn't a gift bestowed from above. It was a fire stoked by those brave enough to confront power's excesses, to demand consequences, and to build something better from the wreckage. Millbrook had learned it. Marcus had lived it. And as the recruits saluted the crowd, he knew they'd carry it forward. The air was thick with tension, a heavy shroud pressing down on Marcus as he stood rooted to the spot, facing 3 police officers and a snarling German shepherd straining against its leash. His voice, steady and clear despite the tremor threatening to break through, cut through the night. "I have ID," he said, his words deliberate, almost too calm for a teenager staring down such an intimidating scene. "It proves I live here. My father is." "On your knees," Officer Barrett's command sliced through Marcus's explanation like a blade, sharp and unyielding. The streetlights cast long, jagged shadows across the pavement, amplifying the menace in Barrett's stance. Beside him, Officer Handler Stevens emerged from the patrol car, his K-9 partner growling low, a guttural sound that vibrated through Marcus's chest. The dog's eyes glinted in the dim light, its muscles taut, ready to lunge. Marcus's legs felt like they might buckle beneath him, a wave of dizziness washing over him. But he locked his knees and held his ground. "Sir, I respectfully decline," he said, his voice quieter now but no less firm. "I've done nothing wrong. I have the right to." "On your knees," Barrett barked again, his voice booming down the quiet suburban street, rattling the stillness. Officer Reynolds, standing a few feet away, shifted closer, his hand tightening around the grip of his holstered weapon. The faint buzz of Marcus's phone vibrated in his pocket, a lifeline. He knew. It had to be his father responding to the emergency alert he'd sent moments ago. Help was coming. He just had to stay calm, keep breathing, hold on a little longer. His heart thudded against his ribcage, but his face remained a mask of composure, a shield against the rising panic. Handler Stevens stepped forward, the German shepherd's barks growing sharper, more insistent, its teeth bared as it tugged against the leash. "Last chance, kid," Stevens warned, his tone cold and clipped. "Get on the ground, or Rex here is going to help you down." The dog's growls seemed to echo off the houses lining the street, drawing more eyes to the unfolding drama. A crowd of neighbors had begun to gather, spilling out onto their lawns and porches, some clutching phones to record the confrontation. Mrs. Henderson, a weary woman with gray-streaked hair, stood out among them, her hands trembling as she pressed her phone to her ear, her voice frantic as she spoke to someone likely trying to summon help from Marcus. Her eyes darted between the officers and the teenager she'd known since he was a boy. A mix of fear and outrage etched into her weathered face. Marcus inhaled deeply, the cool night air stinging his lungs. "Officers," he said, his words measured, "I'm not getting on my knees. I've done nothing wrong. I live in this neighborhood, and I'm trying to show you my ID. The dog isn't necessary. I'd like to call my father." "Who is?" "Release the dog," Barrett ordered, cutting him off again, his hands slashing through the air. But Stevens hesitated, his grip tightening on the leash as he glanced at the growing crowd. The neighbors' murmurs swelled, their phones capturing every second, every movement. In that fragile, suspended moment, the screech of tires shattered the tension like glass breaking. A black SUV roared around the corner, its blue and red lights flashing wildly, painting the street in a chaotic dance of color. Marcus's knees nearly gave out then from fear, but from a flood of relief so intense it almost drowned him. He knew that vehicle. It was his father Spauld's Chief Michael Johnson's official car. The tide was about to turn. The SUV skidded to a stop 30 feet away, its engine still rumbling as the lights pulsed through the darkness. The crowd shifted, their attention snapping to the new rival, phones still rolling. Before anyone could fully process what was happening, the driver's door flew open, and Chief Michael Johnson stepped out, his broad frame radiating authority. His uniform was crisp, his badge catching the streetlight's glow, and his presence seemed to suck the air out of the scene. Officer Barrett's face went ashen, the color draining from his cheeks as recognition hit him like a punch. He'd met the chief just last week during a department briefing, his new boss, the man now striding toward them with fire in his eyes. Barrett's hand, which had been raised to signal Stevens, fell limp to his side. "Stand down." Chief Johnson's voice thundered across the street, deep and commanding, leaving no room for defiance. "Everyone, stand down." He moved with purpose, his boots striking the pavement in a steady rhythm, closing the distance between himself and the officers. "Handler Stevens, get that dog back in the vehicle, now." Marcus stood frozen, his pulse hammering in his ears, but he kept his expression steady, watching his father approach. In that moment, Michael Johnson wasn't the man who flipped pancakes on Sunday mornings, humming off-key to old jazz records. He was the city's highest-ranking law enforcement officer, a towering figure of justice. Stevens obeyed instantly, retreating with Rex, who had fallen silent, sensing the shift in power. The German shepherd sat obediently at its handler's side, its earlier aggression replaced by an almost eerie calm. "Chief Johnson, sir," Officer Reynolds stammered, fumbling to holster his weapon, his fingers clumsy with nerves. "We were responding to a suspicious person report." "A suspicious person report." Chief Johnson's voice was low now, controlled, but laced with a razor-sharp edge that made all three officers flinch. "Was this called in by dispatch? Or did you three decide my son looked suspicious enough to warrant a K-9 unit?" His gaze swept over them, piercing and unrelenting. Barrett opened his mouth, his lips trembling as the weight of their mistake crashed down on him. "Your son," he managed, his voice barely above a whisper. "Sir, we had no idea." Clearly, Chief Johnson snapped, cutting him off. He turned to Marcus, his stern expression softening just a fraction, though his eyes still burned with a mix of fury and concern. "Are you all right, son?" "Yes, sir," Marcus replied, his voice steady despite the storm raging inside him. "I followed your instructions. The emergency alert worked. I kept everything recorded." He slowly pulled his hand from his pocket, revealing his phone, its screen still glowing as it captured the scene. Chief Johnson nodded, a flicker of pride breaking through his anger, though his jaw remained tight. Then he turned back to his officers, his tone shifting to one of cold, official authority. "I want your body cameras preserved immediately. No deletions, no edits. Handler Stevens. That includes any vehicle cameras from the K-9 unit." The crowd had grown quiet, their phones still raised, watching the drama unfold with bated breath. Mrs. Henderson pushed forward, her voice quivering but resolute. "Chief Johnson, I tried to tell them Marcus lives here. They wouldn't listen to any of us." Her hands were clenched into fists, her eyes glistening with unshed tears as she recounted her futile attempts to intervene. "Thank you, Mrs. Henderson," Chief Johnson said, his tone gentler as he acknowledged her. Then he faced his officers again, his voice rising. "Officers Barrett and Reynolds, you'll report to my office first thing tomorrow morning. Handler Stevens, you too. Now, I want all of you to look around. Look at these neighbors recording this. Look at their faces." The officers hesitated, then turned reluctantly, their eyes sweeping over the crowd. Dozens of phones glinted in the darkness, capturing their every move. Faces stared back, some shocked, some furious, others etched with quiet disappointment. "This is your community," Chief Johnson continued, his voice carrying to every corner of the street. "These are the people you're supposed to protect and serve. Instead, you were ready to unleash an attack dog on an innocent teenager for the crime of walking home." From basketball practice, Marcus watched as the officers squirmed under his father's words, their bravado crumbling. Barrett shifted his weight, his boots scuffing the pavement, while Reynolds stared at the ground, his hands twitching at his sides. Stevens kept his gaze on Rex, avoiding the chief's piercing stare. In the distance, more police vehicles rolled up, their lights flashing as officers responded to Marcus's alert. The night had grown colder, the chill seeping into Marcus's bones, but he barely felt it. His focus was on his father, on the weight of this moment. "Sir," Barrett tried again, his voice weak. "Department protocol for suspicious persons." "Do not." Chief Johnson's voice cracked like a whip, silencing him. "Attempt to justify this by citing protocols you selectively enforce. I've been in law enforcement for 25 years. I wrote half the protocols you're currently violating." He turned to the crowd, his tone shifting to one of public address. "I apologize to everyone who had to witness this tonight. This is not what our police department stands for. I assure you, there will be a full investigation." Finally, he placed a hand on Marcus's shoulder, firm but gentle. "Let's go home, son. Your mother's worried." As they turned to leave, Chief Johnson glanced back at his officers one last time. "Tomorrow morning, 8 a.m. sharp. Bring your union representatives. You're going to need them." The crowd began to thin, neighbors drifting back to their homes, their murmurs lingering in the air. Marcus and his father walked toward their house, a 2-minute trek that stretched into an eternity. Chief Johnson's hand stayed on Marcus's shoulder, a steady anchor as they approached their colonial-style home. Lisa Johnson, Marcus's mother, stood on the porch, her silhouette framed by the warm glow of the entryway. Her face was a map of worry, her eyes wide as she clutched her phone, the emergency alert still flashing on the screen. "Baby, are you okay?" she called, rushing down the steps, her slippers slapping against the wood. She threw her arms around Marcus, pulling him close. He towered over her now, but in her embrace, he felt small again, safe. "I'm fine, Mom," he said, his voice cracking slightly as the adrenaline began to ebb. Dad got there before anything serious happened. Inside, the family gathered in the living room, the space still carrying the faint scent of that morning's breakfast panks and coffee. Chief Johnson loosened his tie with shaking hands, the stern facade of the police chief melting away to reveal a father rattled to his core. "Let me see the recording," he said, his voice heavy with both parental concern and professional duty. Marcus handed over his phone, and they watched together, Lisa gasping as the K9 unit appeared, her hand flying to her mouth. "You did everything right, son," Chief Johnson said when the video ended, his voice thick with emotion. "Everything we talked about. You stayed calm, you recorded it, you knew your rights." He paused, swallowing hard. But seeing them ready to release that dog, Marcus sank into the leather couch between his parents, the cushions creaking under his weight. "I kept thinking about all those talks we had, all your training, Dad. But those officers, they never even gave me a chance to explain who I was." "That's exactly the problem," Lisa interjected, her voice sharp with the insight of a sociology professor. "They didn't see the captain of the basketball team, or the honor student, or even just a teenager walking home. They saw what they wanted to see," Chief Johnson finished, standing and crossing to the fireplace. His official portrait hung there, a symbol of his new role, installed just last week. "You know, when I took this job, some people said I was chosen just to check a box. But nights like this prove why I'm here. Justice isn't just a word, it's a promise. And when power is abused, the consequences ripple far beyond one moment." The lesson hung heavy in the room, a truth Marcus felt deep in his bones. This wasn't just about him anymore, it was about a system that needed to change, about the cost of unchecked authority, and about a community that deserved better. Outside, the night settled into silence, but inside, the fight for justice was just beginning. Marcus stood in the dimly lit living room, his gaze fixed on the glass frame that held his father's portrait. The reflection of Chief Michael Johnson stared back at him, a stern yet familiar face etched with years of duty. The weight of the evening pressed against Marcus's chest, a swirling mix of anger, pride, and uncertainty. His father's voice broke the silence, steady but tinged with resolve. "What are you going to do?" Marcus asked, his tone soft yet searching, as if testing the depth of the promise he'd heard so many times before. Chief Johnson turned from the portrait, his broad shoulders casting a shadow across the hardwood floor. "What I swore to do when I took this badge," he replied, his words deliberate. each one landing like a stone in still water. I'm going to make real change happen, not just for show, not to polish the department's image, but because it's right. He paused, his dark eyes sweeping over his family, settling on his wife, Lisa, and then back to Marcus. But before any of that, we need to figure out what this means for us, for you. Lisa's fingers tightened around Marcus's hand, her grip warm but firm. A mother's instinct to shield him from the storm she knew was brewing. Her voice trembled slightly as she spoke, her mind racing with memories of their old neighborhood, a place where the streets felt safer, where incidents like this didn't claw at her peace. Maybe we should think about moving back, she suggested, her eyes darting between her husband and son. Somewhere this kind of thing doesn't, but Marcus cut her off, his voice rising with a firmness that startled them both. No, Mom, if we run, nothing changes. Those officers will just keep doing this to other kids who don't have a police chief. For a dad to step in, his chest heaved as he spoke, his resolve hardening with every word. He could feel the heat of their stares, the weight of their surprise, but he didn't waver. Chief Johnson's lips curved into a faint, proud smile, his eyes gleaming with a mix of admiration and relief. He's right, Lisa, he said, stepping closer to his son. Running won't fix this. It never has. He rested a hand on Marcus's shoulder, the gesture heavy with unspoken trust. But, son, you need to know tomorrow's going to be brutal. The body cam footage from those officers lines up with your recording. This isn't staying quiet. The media's going to turn it into a wildfire. Lisa's protective instincts flared, her voice sharpening as she leaned forward. Are you ready for that, Marcus? For everyone at school to know? For the stares, the whispers, maybe worse. Her brow furrowed, her mind already picturing the Coast News vans, the headlines, the scrutiny that would follow her son like a shadow. Marcus rose from the couch, his movements deliberate, and crossed the room to where his varsity jacket hung by the door. The fabric was worn but sturdy, a symbol of the basketball team he captained. The letter C wasn't sewn on yet, but he traced the spot where it would go, his fingers lingering as if drawing strength from it. You've always told me leadership isn't just a title, Dad, he said, turning to face his father. It's about standing up when things are wrong, not just wearing the badge or the jacket, but proving it. His voice was steady now, a quiet fire burning beneath it. Before anyone could respond, the family's security system let out a sharp chime, jolting them all. Through the front windows, headlights pierced the Dust News vans, their engines humming as reporters spilled out onto the lawn. Word had spread faster than a brush fire in dry grass. It's going to be a long night, Chief Johnson muttered, reaching for his phone. I've got calls to Macath Mayor, the union, the PR team. He paused, locking eyes with Marcus. But first, I need you to hear this. What happened tonight isn't okay. I won't let it get buried like so many other times. Lisa stood, her educator's mind kicking into gear, her hands already fidgeting as if itching to grab a pen. We need to document everything, she said, her voice firming up. Marcus, write it all down, every word, every detail you remember. It matters. It all matters. Outside, the night grew louder, the hum of satellite dishes and murmured speculation seeping through the walls. The Johnson family braced themselves, knowing the coming hours wouldn't just test their resolve, but could reshape their entire community. By morning, the stakes would be clear. This could fade into another fleeting headline, or it could spark the kind of reform the department desperately needed. The lesson was already taking root in Marcus's injustice wasn't a gift, it was a fight, and the misuse of power carried a cost that rippled far beyond the moment. The next morning arrived with a clamor that rattled the windows of the Johnson home. By 7:30 a.m., Chief Johnson sat in his office at police headquarters, the air thick with the scent of stale coffee and tension. He replayed the body cam footage for the fourth time, his jaw tightening as the grainy images flickered across his screen. Each frame stoked the fire in his gut. Officers' raised voices, the unnecessary escalation, the glint of a K-9 unit's collar in the streetlight. It matched Marcus's recording perfectly, a damning mirror of truth. He kept his composure, his face a mask of professionalism, but inside, his blood simmered. Beyond his office door, the department buzzed like a hive under threat. Officers hurried past, their footsteps quick and deliberate. their eyes averted from the glass windows that framed their chief. At exactly 8 a.m., a sharp knock cut through the quiet. "Enter," Chief Johnson called, his voice a low rumble of authority. The door swung open, and in filed officers Barrett, Reynolds, and Handler Stevens, trailed by their union reps. The three men looked haggard, dark circles bruising the skin beneath their eyes, their uniforms crisp but their postures stiff with dread. Barrett's hands shook as he lowered himself into a chair, a detail Chief Johnson noted with a flicker of satisfaction. They should be nervous, he thought, leaning back in his seat. "Sit," he instructed, gesturing to the row of chairs before his desk. The union rep, Tom Miller, a weary man with a clipped voice, spoke first. "We'd like to state that these officers had no idea," Chief Johnson cut him off, his tone sharp but controlled. "With all due respect, Tom, that's the problem. They shouldn't need to know they're dealing with my son to do their jobs right." He pressed a key on his computer, and the Bodycam footage flared to life on the wall-mounted screen. The officers flinched as their own actions played out, shouting without cause, advancing on an unarmed teen who'd stayed calm, the K-9 unit looming like a coiled threat. The room grew heavy with silence, broken only by the muffled audio of Marcus's voice offering his ID. Chief Johnson fixed his gaze on Stevens, the K-9 handler, whose broad frame seemed to shrink under the scrutiny. "Explain to me," he said, his voice steady but edged with steel, "why you thought a police dog was necessary for a kid with a basketball bag." Stevens shifted, his chair creaking under him. "Sir, we got a call about a suspicious person." And when backup arrived, Chief Johnson leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. "A suspicious person in a varsity jacket, carrying a basketball, offering his ID. Try again." Meanwhile, across town at Pine Grove High School, Marcus sat in his AP history class, the weight of a dozen stares pressing against him. The room buzzed with whispers, the news of the viral video shot by neighbors with shaky phone camera spreading like wildfire through the small town. Some classmates offered quiet nods of support, their eyes warm with encouragement, while others fidgeted, unsure how to navigate the shift in their perception of him. Mr. Rodriguez, a weary man with a passion for teaching, seized the moment. "Class," he said, setting aside his planned lesson, "since we're exploring civil rights, let's talk about how history echoes in our lives today." Marcus felt the room tilt toward him, but he kept his head high, the lesson of justice sinking deeper into his bones. Back at headquarters, Chief Johnson laid out the consequences, his voice a hammer striking iron. "Officer Barrett, Officer Reynolds suspended without pay, pending a full investigation. Handler Stevens, you're reassigned to desk duty, and the K-9 unit's suspended until we overhaul its protocols." Barrett sputtered, his face reddening. "Sir, we followed standard procedure for suspicious calls." Chief Johnson silenced him with a raised hand, pulling a stack of reports from his desk. "Standard procedure? I spent all night digging through your stop records. Care to explain why 85% of your suspicious persons over the last year were young black men in white neighborhoods?" The question hung in the air, unanswered, as the union rep scribbled furiously. "Here's the plan," he continued, rising to his full height. "Noon today, we hold a press conference. We announce the suspensions, launch a policy review, and mandate bias and de-escalation training for every officer. And if this investigation uncovers more buried incidents, those suspensions turn permanent. Change isn't a promise, it's an action." As the officers filed out, their heads low, Chief Johnson's phone buzzed. A text from Marcus: "Some kids are planning a peaceful protest at the station this afternoon. Don't worry, Dad, we're doing it right." A faint smile tugged at his lips, pride swelling in his chest. He turned to prepare for the press conference, knowing the next few hours would define his legacy and the department's future. Outside, the suspended officers shuffled past their colleagues, their badges surrendered, their service weapons locked away. The building hummed with the promise of transformation, a reckoning for power misused. 2 weeks later, the police department's conference room crackled with tension. Deputy Chief Sarah Martinez, a sharp-eyed woman with a reputation for fairness, stood before a screen displaying her investigation's findings. Around the table sat a mix of internal affairs reps, oversight committee members, And ACLU attorneys, their faces a gallery of anticipation and unease. The Marcus Johnson incident isn't isolated, Martinez began, clicking through slides. Over 3 years, Officers Barrett and Reynolds made 847 suspicious person stops. 726 involved young men of color. In mostly white areas, murmurs rippled through the room as charts flashed on screen. Stark and undeniable, Chief Johnson, seated at the table's head, kept his expression neutral, though the numbers cut deeper than he'd expected. He'd stepped back from the investigation, trusting Martinez to unearth the truth without his shadow looming over it. The K-9 unit, she added, was deployed 192 times in similar cases, excessive and often unjustified. The room grew still, the weight of the data settling like dust after a storm. Martinez's voice sharpened. This isn't just about one night. It's a pattern of failure of accountability that's eroded trust. Around her, the minor players shifted. A Miller, the union rep, scribbled notes with a furrowed brow. An internal affairs officer tapped his pen nervously. An ACLU attorney leaned forward, her eyes alight with purpose. Chief Johnson felt the lesson crystallize. Justice demanded vigilance, and power unchecked bred corruption. The path forward was clearform or ruin. The air in the police station hung heavy with tension. As Deputy Chief Martinez stood before the Oversight Committee, her voice steady but laced with an undercurrent of frustration, she flipped through the pages of Handler Stevens's deployment records, each line revealing a troubling pattern that gnawed at her conscience. Stevens, a broad-shouldered man with a perpetually furrowed brow, had a habit of letting his K-9 unit loose during routine traffic stops, where no weapons were found, no threats detected, just ordinary citizens caught in the jaws of his intimidation tactics. Martinez's dark eyes flickered with a mix of anger and resolve as she recounted the numbers. Dozens of incidents, most involving people who didn't fit the affluent neighborhood's polished mold. She could still hear the faint whimper of a child from one dashcam recording, a sound that had haunted her sleepless nights. Across the table, Mrs. Chen, the head of the Oversight Committee, adjusted her glasses and raised a trembling hand, her lined face etched with concern. Her voice, soft yet piercing, cut through the room's murmurs. "Were there any prior complaints against these officers?" she asked, her tone carrying the weight of someone who'd seen too many injustices swept under the rug. Martinez nodded grimly, her jaw tightening as she pulled out a thick folder. 27 formal complaints, she replied, letting the number linger in the air like a bitter taste. But here's the kicker: most were dismissed as unfounded without so much as a proper look. The old administration had a knack for burying anything hinting at racial bias, especially if it came from Pine Grove's less privileged corners. Mrs. Chen's lips pressed into a thin line, her fingers drumming silently on the table as she absorbed the betrayal of trust woven into those words. Meanwhile, miles away at Pine Grove High School, the cafeteria buzzed with the chaotic energy of lunchtime. Marcus Johnson sat at a scratch wooden table, surrounded by a kaleidoscope of faces: Black, Latino, Asian, Whittle, united by a shared fire in their eyes. He'd never pictured himself as a leader, not with his lanky frame and quiet demeanor. But here he was, the unexpected heartbeat of the Youth for Police Accountability Club. The group had sprung up like wildflowers after his own run-in with Stevens's snarling dog, and now they were plotting their third demonstration. Marcus leaned forward, his voice low but steady, as he pitched a new idea to the circle. "Protests are loud, sure, but what if we tried talking instead? Invite some officers to sit with us, hear us out. My dad always says change starts when you stop shouting and start listening." His friends exchanged glances, some skeptical, some intrigued, but the seed was planted, and Marcus felt a flicker of hope ignite in his chest. Back in the conference room, the atmosphere thickened as Martinez reached the crux of her presentation. She clicked to a slide that made the room gasp, a sprawling web of data, showing that Stevens wasn't an outlier. This wasn't just about 3 rogue officers, it was a festering culture within the department, one that seemed to relish targeting anyone deemed an outsider in the city's wealthier enclaves. James Washington, the ACLU attorney with a sharp jawline and sharper wit, leaned forward, his chair creaking under his weight. "This is systemic," he said, his voice a low rumble. "You can't just slap a few wrists and call it justice. We need reform root and branch." His words landed like a gauntlet, and Chief Johnson, a towering figure with graying temples and a weary gaze, finally broke his silence. "I agree," he said, his deep timbre cutting through the tension. "Martinez, let's hear your plan." Martinez straightened, her fingers trembling slightly as she clicked to her final slides. "First, Officers Barrett and Reynolds terminated. Their records show repeated policy violations and clear evidence of bias. So blatant it's almost a caricature. Second, Handler Stevens gets a permanent reassignment. And we're gutting the K-9 unit's protocols from top to bottom. No more dogs. 6 on civilians for kicks. Beyond that, we're rolling out body camera software that flags biased interactions. Mandatory monthly audits of stop data to catch profiling in its tracks. And a community oversight board with teeth real power to dig into complaints. The room erupted into a cacophony of whispers and nods, each proposal painting a vision of accountability that felt both radical and overdue. Outside, news vans lined the street, their reporters pacing like hawks, cameras poised to capture what locals were already dubbing a turning point for the city. At the Johnson family home, Marcus sat cross-legged on the floor of his father's cluttered office, a sea of papers and emails spilling around him. His mother, Lisa, a woman with warm eyes and a spine of steel, sorted through the pile with him. Since Marcus's encounter with Stevens had gone public, their inbox had become a floodgate series of harassment from others, notes of solidarity, even a letter from a retired cop. His handwriting shaky with remorse, Marcus held it up, his voice catching. "Mom, listen to Thish says he stayed quiet about stuff like this for years. But what happened to me finally made him speak. Says he's sorry." Lisa's smile was soft but fierce as she ruffled his hair. "You took a nightmare and turned it into a spark, baby. Just like your dad's doing downtown." Marcus felt a swell of pride, tinged with the ache of what he'd endured, as he imagined his father facing the department's demons head-on. The meeting at headquarters drew to a close. With a unanimous vote every reform Martinez proposed would move forward. Chief Johnson rose, his broad shoulders squared as he addressed the room. "This investigation laid bare some ugly truths about us," he said, his voice heavy with both sorrow and determination. "We can cling to the old ways and watch the community turn its back, or we can step up and show the world what policing can be." As people filtered out, Martinez approached him, her expression taut. "Sir, Barrett and Reynolds want to sit down before they're officially cut loose. They say they owe Marcus an apology." Johnson's brow furrowed, his mind drifting to his son. "I'll talk to him," he said after a long pause. "It's his call." From his office window, he watched the crowd below, students, parents, and Marcus's club among them, their signs pleading not for vengeance, but for a new dawn. The investigation hadn't just exposed rot, it had cracked open a door to something better. A month later, the department's training room brimmed with officers, their blue uniforms a sea of shifting emotion, skepticism, curiosity, hope. Chief Johnson stood at the podium, his presence commanding yet softened by the weight of his personal stake. "Today's the start of something new," he began, his gaze sweeping the room. "What happened to Marcus could have happened to any of your kids. The difference, he had a phone rolling and a dad in this chair." In the front row sat Lisa, now leading the community relations board, her posture radiating purpose. Beside her, Marcus, barely 16, but carrying himself with quiet gravitas, had taken on a role as youth advisor. Next to him was Mrs. Henderson, a weary woman with a no-nonsense stare, representing the revamped neighborhood watch. She'd spent years nagging the precinct about petty thefts. Now, she had a voice in its rebirth. Johnson clicked to his first slide, unveiling a recruitment overhaul: new hires, new training, new priorities. Martinez stepped up, her voice crisp. 6 weeks of mandatory training for every FI: Serbia's recognition, de-escalation, community engagement. No shortcuts, no exceptions. In the back, Handler Stevens, now a training coordinator, gave a curt nod. Stripped of his K-9 leash, he'd been humbled, his once arrogant swagger replaced by a grudging respect for the reforms his own actions had spurred. Marcus watched it all, his fingers tracing the edge of a notebook where he'd scribbled ideas for youth outreach. He'd seen firsthand how fear could widen the gap between cops and kids. Now, he was determined to bridge it. The changes piled up: 3 cameras per patrol car, daily footage reviews by civilians, extra scrutiny on stops involving minorities or teens. Then came the Know Your Neighbor program, officers trading badges for handshakes at block parties, school visits, and barbecues. Lisa took the stage, her voice warm but firm. Our board will host monthly forum soap and mix for the community. Plus, an anonymous tip line for any anesthetizans or cops to report wrongdoing without looking over there shoulder. A few veteran officers squirmed, their arms crossed, but the younger ones leaned in, eyes bright with the promise of a job they'd signed up for, to protect, not to dominate. Johnson's tone hardened as he addressed the elephant in the room. Barrett and Reynolds chose power over duty. Their exit says it loud: bias has no place here. But we're not just punishing, we're preventing. Marcus stood when his father nodded to him, his heart pounding as he faced the room. I'm not here to settle scores, he said, his voice ringing clear. I'm here because no kid should feel hunted walking home from practice, no matter their skin or their street. The room softened, a ripple of applause. These officers saw their own families in his words, and for a moment, the divide shrank. As the session wrapped, Johnson unveiled the new motto: Protect, Serve, Unite, flashing on the screen, with photos of cops laughing with kids, helping elders. This won't be easy, he admitted. It means owning our mistakes, rewiring how we think, but it's the only way to win back trust. Officers lingered after, some clasping Marcus's hand, others pitching ideas to Lisa. Outside, the city buzzed with cautious optimism. The lesson stark and clear: justice demands accountability, and power unchecked breeds ruin. For Marcus, his parents, and a department on the cusp, the path ahead shimmered with hard-won possibility. The air inside the auditorium of Pine Grove High School buzzed with an energy that felt almost tangibly blend of hope, resolve, and an earnest yearning for something better. It was a stark contrast to the world beyond those walls 6 months earlier, where tension had coiled like a snake ready to strike. Outside, television vans lined the streets, their crews pacing restlessly, cameras poised to capture the latest updates on the reforms sweeping through the town. But the real narrative wasn't unfolding in the polished words of a press release or the dry pages of policy papers. It was alive in the quiet, meaningful moments beginning to ripple through the communities that carried the weight of transformation. Officers, once distant figures in crisp uniforms, were now pausing during their patrols to ask after a neighbor's name, their voices softening as they lingered to listen. Meetings were being penciled into schedules, not out of obligation, but with genuine intent. Advisory councils forming like fragile new roots, pushing through the soil. Bridges, shaky at first, were being built between the police and the people they served, each plank laid with care and a flicker of trust. What could have shattered this community into irreparable pitches? A single night of fear and confrontation had instead become the spark that drew them closer, a testament to the idea that even the bleakest shadows could give way to light. 6 months had passed since that night, and now the auditorium swelled with voices and faces, every seat taken, every aisle crowded. Marcus Johnson stood at the podium, his broad shoulders squared, his gaze sweeping over the sea of people before him: black, white, Asian, Hispanic, a mosaic of a town that had once felt so divided. The lights above cast a warm glow on his face, illuminating the strength in his eyes, a strength forged in a moment of terror he'd never expected to survive, let alone reshape. Behind him sat his father, Chief Johnson, the lines of his face etched with pride and a quiet awe, flanked by city officials and community leaders. Among them were officers Barrett and Reynolds, their uniforms crisp but their expressions unguarded, almost vulnerable. They'd asked to speak, to share the jagged path they'd walked from ignorance to accountability, and Marcus had welcomed them without hesitation. When I found myself staring down those police officers that night, Marcus began, his voice steady and resonant, cutting through the hum of the room. I couldn't have dreamed it would lead me here. His words hung in the air, heavy with the memory of barking dogs and flashing lights. A night that could have ended in blood and headlines of sorrow. Instead, it had ignited something extraordinary, a story of redemption and renewal in the audience. Mrs. Henderson dabbed at her eyes with a crumpled tissue, her grandson beside her, his chest puffed with quiet pride. He was part of the Youth for Police Accountability group Marcus had poured his heart into founding, a movement that had swelled to over 100 members across 3 high schools, each one a young voice determined to be heard. Marcus leaned into the microphone, his tone growing firmer. Today, I want to talk numbers, not just to impress you, but to show you what's possible. In the last 6 months, our police department has seen complaints drop by 85%. Trust in our community has climbed by 70%. But the number that matters most, 0. That's how many bias-based stops have been reported since we rewrote the rules. A murmur of approval rippled through the crowd, a sound like the first drops of rain after a drought. Chief Johnson watched his son, his chest tight with emotion. The boy who'd once stood trembling before police dogs had grown into a leader, a bridge between the raw anger of youth and the rigid world of law enforcement, speaking to both with a clarity that demanded respect. Then came Officers Barrett and Reynolds, stepping forward when Marcus beckoned them, their boots heavy on the wooden stage. Barrett, his face weathered and his eyes shadowed with regret, gripped the podium's edge. "We were wrong," he said, his voice cracking like dry timber. "That night, we let fear and prejudice steer us. We could have destroyed lives, Marcus's, his family's, our own, but they forgave us, they guided us. Now we're here, trying to fix what we broke." Reynolds nodded beside him, his hands clasped tight, as if holding onto the weight of his own shame. Over the past months, they'd traveled the state, standing before other officers, peeling back their mistakes like layers of skin, offering their story as a warning and a plea. The crowd listened, some with clenched jaws, others with softening eyes, all feeling the raw honesty of men who'd chosen to face themselves. The summit wasn't just a stage for speeches, it was a showcase of a community reborn. The Police Youth Advisory Council, led by Marcus, had blossomed into a force of its own, crafting programs that invited officers into schools not as enforcers, but as mentors, their badges gleaming less with authority and more with approachability. The K-9 unit, once a symbol of intimidation, had shifted under new leadership, its dogs now padded into classrooms and nursing homes, tails wagging, offering comfort instead of fear. Dr. Lisa Johnson, Marcus's mother, stepped forward next, her clipboard trembling slightly in her hands as she presented the data. The Know Your Neighbor initiative had turned officers into familiar fast-coaching soccer teams, flipping burgers at block parties, hauling trash bags during cleanup days. The numbers didn't lie. Trust was no longer a scarce commodity in Pine Grove. As the event drew to a close, Marcus's voice rose one last time, cutting through the chatter. Real change doesn't come from a stack of papers or a new rule book. It comes from people brave enough to own their mistakes, to sit down and listen, to roll up their sleeves and build something better together. The words landed like stones in still water, sending ripples through the room. People lingered afterward, clustering in tight knots, their voices alive with ideas, plans for garden projects, tutoring programs, a summer youth academy led by Officer Stevens, whose easy grin and open demeanor had made him the heart of the department's outreach efforts. Outside, news crews swarmed, their microphones thrust toward anyone willing to talk. Pine Grove's story had spread beyond its borders, drawing curious eyes from police departments nationwide, some even sending delegates to study the miracle unfolding here. Marcus found himself encircled by teenagers, their faces bright with questions and determination. "This isn't just about fixing the police," he told them, his voice low but fierce. "It's about creating a place where every single one of us feels safe, seen, and valued." Chief Johnson stood at a distance, watching his son with a lump in his throat. He could still smell the damp grass of that awful night 6 months ago, hear the snarling dogs and Marcus's shaky breaths. What could have fractured their town beyond repair had instead woven it tighter, thread by thread, into something whole. As dusk painted the sky in hues of orange and gold, families strolled home together, black, white, Asian, Hispanic, clawing with officers who now called them by name. Their uniforms no longer a barrier but a bond. The lesson lingered in the air, unspoken but undeniable. Justice wasn't just a verdict or a punishment, it was a promise kept, a trust earned. And the consequences of power, when wielded without care, could either break a community or, with enough courage, remake it. Marcus's final words from the podium echoed in their hearts. Change starts with one voice, one choice, one stand, but it endures only when everyone steps forward together. What began as a teenager's nightmare had become a beacon, proving that even the deepest wounds could heal into something beautiful. When people chose compassion over chaos, unity over fracture, in Pine Grove, the future wasn't just bright, it was theirs to shape.